Chapter the 21st, Book the First of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Alice Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Book the First, Chapter the 21st. Mr. Merdle's Complaint. Upon that establishment of state, the Merdle establishment in Harley Street, Cavendish Square, there was the shadow of no more common wall than the fronts of other establishments of state on the opposite side of the street. Like unexceptionable society, the opposing rows of houses in Harley Street were very grim with one another. Indeed, the mansions and their inhabitants were so much alike in that respect, that the people were often to be found drawn up on opposite sides of dinner tables, in the shade of their own loftiness, staring at the other side of the way with the dullness of the houses. Everybody knows how like the street the two dinner rows of people who take their stand by the street will be. The expressionless uniform 20 houses, all to be knocked at and rung at in the same form, all approachable by the same dull steps, all fended off by the same pattern of railing, all with the same impracticable fire escapes, the same inconvenient fixtures in their heads, and everything without exception to be taken at a high valuation. Who has not dined with these? The house so drearily out of repair, the occasional bow window, the stuccoed house, the newly fronted house, the corner house with nothing but angular rooms, the house with the blinds always down, the house with the hatchment always up, the house where the collector has called for 1/4 of an idea, and found nobody at home. Who has not dined with these? The house that nobody will take, and is to be had a bargain. Who does not know her? The showy house that was taken for life by the disappointed gentleman, and which does not suit him at all. Who is unacquainted with that haunted habitation? Harley Street, Cavendish Square, was more than aware of Mr. and Mrs. Merdle. Intruders there were in Harley Street, of whom it was not aware. But Mr. and Mrs. Merdle it delighted to honour. Society was aware of Mr. and Mrs. Merdle. Society had said, "Let us license them, let us know them." Mr. Merdle was immensely rich, a man of prodigious enterprise, a Midas without the ears, who turned all he touched to gold. He was in everything good, from banking to building. He was in Parliament, of course. He was in the City, necessarily. He was chairman of this, trustee of that, president of the other. The weightiest of men had said to projectors, "Now, what name have you got? Have you got Merdle?" And the reply being in the negative, had said, "Then I won't look at you." This great and fortunate man had provided that extensive bosom which required so much room to be unfeeling enough in, with a nest of crimson and gold some 15 years before. It was not a bosom to repose upon, but it was a capital bosom to hang jewels upon. Mr. Merdle wanted something to hang jewels upon, and he bought it for the purpose. Storr and Mortimer might have married on the same speculation. Like all his other speculations, it was sound and successful. The jewels showed to the richest advantage. The bosom moving in society with the jewels displayed upon it attracted general admiration. Society approving, Mr. Merdle was satisfied. He was the most disinterested of men, did everything for society, and got as little for himself out of all his gain and care as a man might. That is to say, it may be supposed that he got all he wanted, otherwise with unlimited wealth he would have got it. But his desire was to the utmost to satisfy society, whatever that was, and take up all its drafts upon him for tribute. He did not shine in company. He had not very much to say for himself. He was a reserved man, with a broad, overhanging, watchful head, that particular kind of dull red colour in his cheeks, which is rather stale than fresh, and a somewhat uneasy expression about his coat cuffs, as if they were in his confidence, and had reasons for being anxious to hide his hands. In the little he said, he was a pleasant man enough, plain, emphatic about public and private confidence, and tenacious of the utmost deference being shown by every one in all things to society. In this same society, if that were it which came to his dinners and to Mrs. Merdle's receptions and concerts, he hardly seemed to enjoy himself much, and was mostly to be found against walls and behind doors. Also, when he went out to it, instead of its coming home to him, he seemed a little fatigued, and upon the whole rather more disposed for bed. But he was always cultivating it nevertheless, and always moving in it, and always laying out money on it with the greatest liberality. Mrs. Merdle's first husband had been a colonel, under whose auspices the bosom had entered into competition with the snows of North America, and had come off at little disadvantage in point of whiteness, and at none in point of coldness. The colonel's son was Mrs. Merdle's only child. He was of a chuckle-headed, high-shouldered make, with a general appearance of being not so much a young man as a swelled boy. He had given so few signs of reason, that a byword went among his companions that his brain had been frozen up in a mighty frost which prevailed at St. John's, New Brunswick, at the period of his birth there, and had never thought from that hour. Another byword represented him as having in his infancy, through the negligence of a nurse, fallen out of a high window on his head, which had been heard by responsible witnesses to crack. It is probable that both these representations were of ex post facto origin, the young gentleman, whose expressive name was Sparkler, being monomaniacal in offering marriage to all manners of undesirable young ladies, and in remarking of every successive young lady to whom he tendered a matrimonial proposal that she was a deuced fine girl, well educated too, with no bigot nonsense about her. A son-in-law with these limited talents might have been a clog upon another man, but Mr. Merdle did not want a son-in-law for himself. He wanted a son-in-law for society. Mr. Sparkler having been in the Guards, and being in the habit of frequenting all the races, and all the lounges, and all the parties, and being well known, society was satisfied with its son-in-law. This happy result Mr. Merdle would have considered well attained, though Mr. Sparkler had been a more expensive article. And he did not get Mr. Sparkler by any means cheap for society, even as it was. There was a dinner-giving in the Harley Street establishment, while little Dorrit was stitching at her father's new shirts by his side that night, and there were magnates from the court, and magnates from the city, magnates from the commons, and magnates from the lords, magnates from the bench, and magnates from the bar, bishop magnates, treasury magnates, horse guard magnates, admiralty magnates, all the magnates that keep us going, and sometimes trip us up. "I am told," said Bishop Magnate to horse guards, "that Mr. Merdle has made another enormous hit. They say £100,000. Horse guards had heard 2. Treasury had heard 3. Bar, handling his persuasive double eye-glass, was by no means clear but that it might be 4. It was one of those happy strokes of calculation and combination, the result of which it was difficult to estimate. It was one of those instances of a comprehensive grasp, associated with habitual luck and characteristic boldness, of which an age presented us but few. But here was Brother Bellows, who had been in the great bank case, and who could probably tell us more. What did Brother Bellows put this new success at? Brother Bellows was on his way to make his bow to the bosom, and could only tell them in passing that he had heard it stated, with great appearance of truth, as being worth, from first to last, 500,000 of money. Admiralty said Mr. Merdle was a wonderful man. Treasury said he was a new power in the country, and would be able to buy up the whole House of Commons. Bishop said he was glad to think that this wealth flowed into the coffers of a gentleman who was always disposed to maintain the best interests of society. Mr. Merdle himself was usually late on these occasions, as a man still detained in the clutch of giant enterprises when other men had shaken off their dwarfs for the day. On this occasion he was the last arrival. Treasury said Merdle's work punished him a little. Bishop said he was glad to think that this wealth flowed into the coffers of a gentleman who accepted it with meekness. Powder! There was so much powder in waiting that it flavoured the dinner. Pulverous particles got into the dishes, and society's meats had a seasoning of first-rate footmen. Mr. Merdle took down a countess, who was secluded somewhere in the core of an immense dress, to which she was in the proportion of the heart to the overgrown cabbage. If so low a simile may be admitted, the dress went down the staircase like a richly brocaded jack in the green, and nobody knew what sort of small person carried it. Society had everything it could want, and could not want, for dinner. It had everything to look at, and everything to eat, and everything to drink. It is to be hoped it enjoyed itself, for Mr. Merdle's own share of the repast might have been paid for with 18pence. Mrs. Merdle was magnificent. The chief butler was the next magnificent institution of the day. He was the stateliest man in the company. He did nothing, but he looked on as few other men could have done. He was Mr. Merdle's last gift to society. Mr. Merdle didn't want him, and was put out of countenance when the great creature looked at him. But inner peaceable society would have him, and had got him. The invisible Countess carried out the green at the usual stage of the entertainment, and the file of beauty was closed up by the bosom. Treasury said, Juno. Bishop said, Judith. Bar fell into discussion with horse guards concerning courts-martial. Brothers Bellows and Bench struck in. Other magnates paired off. Mr. Merdle sat silent and looked at the tablecloth. Sometimes a magnate addressed him to turn the stream of his own particular discussion towards him. But Mr. Merdle seldom gave much attention to it, or did more than rouse himself from his calculations and pass the wine. When they rose, so many of the magnates had something to say to Mr. Merdle individually, that he held little levies by the sideboard, and checked them off as they went out at the door. Treasury hoped he might venture to congratulate one of England's world-famed capitalists and merchant princes. He had turned that original sentiment in the House a few times, and it came easy to him, on a new achievement. To extend the triumphs of such men was to extend the triumphs and resources of the nation, and Treasury felt, he gave Mr. Merdle to understand, patriotic on the subject. "Thank you, my lord," said Mr. Merdle. "Thank you. I accept your congratulations with pride, and I am glad you approve." "Why, I don't unreservedly approve, my dear Mr. Merdle, because—" Smiling, Treasury turned him by the arm towards the sideboard and spoke banteringly, "it never can be worth your while to come among us and help us." Mr. Merdle felt honoured by the "No, no," said Treasury, "that is not the light in which one so distinguished for practical knowledge and great foresight can be expected to regard it. If we should ever be happily enabled, by accidentally possessing the control over circumstances, to propose to one so eminent to come among us, and give us the weight of his influence, knowledge, and character, we could only propose it to him as a duty, in fact, as a duty that he owed to society." Mr. Merdle intimated that society was the apple of his eye, and that its claims were paramount to every other consideration. Treasury moved on, and Bar came up. Bar, with his little insinuating jury droop, and fingering his persuasive double eye-glass, hoped he might be excused if he mentioned to one of the greatest converters of the root of all evil into the root of all good, who had for a long time reflected a shining lustre on the annals even of our commercial country, if he mentioned disinterestedly, and as what we lawyers called in our pedantic way amicus curiae, a fact that had come by accident within his knowledge. He had been required to look over the title of a very considerable estate in one of the eastern counties, lying, in fact, for Mr. Merdle knew we lawyers loved to be particular, on the borders of two of the eastern counties, Now, the title was perfectly sound, and the estate was to be purchased by one who had the command of money, jury droop and persuasive eyeglass, on remarkably advantageous terms. This had come to Barr's knowledge only that day, and it had occurred to him, "I shall have the honour of dining with my esteemed friend Mr. Merdle that evening, and, strictly between ourselves, I will mention the opportunity." Such a purchase would involve not only a great legitimate political influence, but some half-dozen church presentations of considerable annual value. Now that Mr. Merdle was already at no loss to discover means of occupying even his capital, and of fully employing even his active and vigorous intellect, Barr well knew, but he would venture to suggest that the question arose in his mind, whether one who had deservedly gained so high a position and so European a reputation did not owe it, we would not say to himself, but we would say to society, to possess himself of such influences as these, and to exercise them, we would not say for his own or for his party's, but we would say for society's benefit. Mr. Merdle again expressed himself as wholly devoted to that object of his constant consideration, and Barr took his persuasive eyeglass up the grand staircase. Bishop then came undesignedly sidling in the direction of the sideboard. Surely the goods of this world, it occurred in an accidental way to Bishop to remark, could scarcely be directed into happier channels than when they accumulated under the magic touch of the wise and sagacious, who, while they knew the just value of riches, Bishop tried here to look as if he were rather poor himself, were aware of their importance, judiciously governed and rightly distributed, to the welfare of our brethren at large. Mr. Merdle with humility expressed his conviction that Bishop couldn't mean him, and with inconsistency expressed his high gratification in Bishop's good opinion. Bishop then, jauntily stepping out a little with his well-shaped right leg, as though he said to Mr. Merdle, "Don't mind the apron, a mere form," put this case to his good friend. Whether it had occurred to his good friend that society might not unreasonably hope that one so blessed in his undertakings, and whose example on his pedestal was so influential with it, would shed a little money in the direction of a mission or so to Africa? Mr. Merdle signifying that the idea should have his best attention, Bishop put another case, whether his good friend had at all interested himself in the proceedings of our combined additional endowed dignitaries committee, and whether it had occurred to him that to shed a little money in that direction might be a great conception finely executed. Mr. Merdle made a similar reply, and Bishop explained his reason for inquiring. Society looked to such men as his good friend to do such things. It was not that he looked to them, but that society looked to them. Just as it was not our committee who wanted the additional endowed dignitaries, but it was society that was in a state of the most agonizing uneasiness of mind until it got them. He begged to assure his good friend that he was extremely sensible of his good friend's regard on all occasions for the best interests of society, and he considered that he was at once consulting those interests and expressing the feeling of society, when he wished him continued prosperity, continued increase of riches, and continued things in general. Bishop then betook himself upstairs, and the other magnates gradually floated up after him until there was no one left below but Mr. Merdle. That gentleman, after looking at the tablecloth until the soul of the chief butler glowed with a noble resentment, went slowly up after the rest, and became of no account in the stream of people on the grand staircase. Mrs. Merdle was at home. The best of the jewels were hung out to be seen. Society got what it came for. Mr. Merdle drank 2 pennyworth of tea in a corner, and got more than he wanted. Among the evening magnates was a famous physician, who knew everybody, and whom everybody knew. On entering at the door, he came upon Mr. Merdle drinking his tea in a corner, and touched him on the arm. Mr. Merdle started. "Oh, it's you! Any better to-day?" "No," said Mr. Merdle, "I am no better." "A pity I didn't see you this morning. Pray come to me to-morrow, or let me come to you." "Well," he replied, I will come to-morrow as I drive by." Bar and Bishop had both been bystanders during this short dialogue, and as Mr. Merdle was swept away by the crowd, he made their remarks upon it to the physician. Bar said, there was a certain point of mental strain beyond which no man could go, that the point varied with various textures of brain and peculiarities of constitution, as he had had occasion to notice in several of his learned brothers. But the point of endurance passed by a line's breadth, depression and dyspepsia ensued. Not to intrude on the sacred mysteries of medicine, he took it, now, with the jury droop and persuasive eye-glass, that this was Merdle's case? Bishop said that when he was a young man, and had fallen for a brief space into the habit of writing sermons on Saturdays, a habit which all young sons of the church should sedulously avoid, he had frequently been sensible of a depression, arising as he supposed from an overtaxed intellect, upon which the yolk of a new-laid egg, beaten up by the good woman in whose house he at that time lodged, with a glass of sound sherry, nutmeg, and powdered sugar, acted like a charm. Without presuming to offer so simple a remedy to the consideration of so profound a professor of the great healing art, he would venture to inquire whether the strain, being by way of intricate calculations, the spirits might not, humanly speaking, be restored to their tone by a gentle and yet generous stimulant? "Yes," said the physician, "yes, you are both right, but I may as well tell you that I can find nothing the matter with Mr. Merdle. He has the constitution of a rhinoceros, the digestion of an ostrich, and the concentration of an oyster. As to nerves, Mr. Merdle is of a cool temperament, and not a sensitive man. He is about as invulnerable, I should say, as Achilles. How such a man should suppose himself unwell without reason, you may think strange, but I have found nothing the matter with him. He may have some deep-seated recondite complaint. I can't say. I only say that at present I have not found it out." There was no shadow of Mr. Merdle's complaint on the bosom now displaying precious stones in rivalry with many similar superb jewel stands. There was no shadow of Mr. Merdle's complaint on young Sparkler, hovering about the rooms, monomaniacally seeking any sufficiently ineligible young lady with no nonsense about her. And there was no shadow of Mr. Merdle's complaint on the barnacles and stilt-stockings, of whom whole colonies were present, or on any of the company. Even on himself, its shadow was faint enough as he moved about among the throng, receiving homage. Mr. Merdle's complaint, society, and he had so much to do with one another in all things else, that it is hard to imagine his complaint, if he had one, being solely his own affair. Had he that deep-seated recondite complaint, and did any doctor find it out? Patience. In the meantime, the shadow of the Marshalsea wall was a real darkening influence, and could be seen on the Dorrit family at any stage of the sun's course. End of chapter the 21st, book the 1st. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter the 22nd, book the 1st, of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Alice Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Book the 1st. Chapter the 22nd. A Puzzle. Mr. Clennam did not increase in favour with the father of the Marshalsea in the ratio of his increasing visits. His obtuseness on the great testimonial question was not calculated to awaken admiration in the paternal breast, but had rather a tendency to give offence in that sensitive quarter, and to be regarded as a positive shortcoming in point of gentlemanly feeling. An impression of disappointment, occasioned by the discovery that Mr. Clennam scarcely possessed that delicacy for which, in the confidence of his nature, he had been inclined to give him credit, began to darken the fatherly mind in connection with that gentleman. The father went so far as to say, in his private family circle, that he feared Mr. Clennam was not a man of high instincts. He was happy, he observed, in his public capacity as leader and representative of the college, to receive Mr. Clennam when he called to pay his respects, but he didn't find that he got on with him personally. There appeared to be something, he didn't know what it was, wanting in him. Howbeit, the father did not fail in any outward show of politeness, but, on the contrary, honoured him with much attention, perhaps cherishing the hope that, although not a man of a sufficiently brilliant and spontaneous turn of mind to repeat his former testimonial unsolicited, it might still be within the compass of his nature to bear the part of a responsive gentleman in any correspondence that way tending. In the threefold capacity of the gentleman from outside who had been accidentally locked in on the night of his first appearance, of the gentleman from outside who had inquired into the affairs of the father of the Marshalsea with the stupendous idea of getting him out, and of the gentleman from outside who took an interest in the child of the Marshalsea, Clennam soon became a visitor of mark. He was not surprised by the attentions he received from Mr. Chivery when that officer was on the lock, for he made little distinction between Mr. Chivery's politeness and that of the other turnkeys. It was on one particular afternoon that Mr. Chivery surprised him all at once, and stood forth from his companions in bold relief. Mr. Chivery, by some artful exercise of his power of clearing the lodge, had contrived to rid it of all sauntering collegians, so that Clennam, coming out of the prison, should find him on duty alone. "Private, I ask your pardon, sir," said Mr. Chivery in a secret manner, "but which way might you be going?" "I am going over the bridge." He saw in Mr. Chivery with some astonishment quite an allegory of silence, as he stood with his key on his lips. "Private, I ask your pardon again," said Mr. Chivery, "but could you go round by Horsemonger Lane? Could you by any means find time to look in at that address?" Handing him a little card, printed for circulation among the connection of Chivery and Co., tobacconists, importers of pure Havana cigars, Bengal cheroots, and fine-flavoured Cubas, dealers in fancy snuffs, etc., etc. "Private, it ain't tobacco business," said Mr. Chivery. "The truth is, it's my wife. She's wishful to say a word to you, sir, upon a point respecting—" "Yes," said Mr. Chivery, answering Clennam's look of apprehension with a nod, "respecting her." "I will make a point of seeing your wife directly." "Thank you, sir, much obliged. It ain't above 10 minutes out of your way. Please to ask for Mrs. Chivery." These instructions, Mr. Chivery, who had already let him out, cautiously called through a little slide in the outer door, which he could draw back from within for the inspection of visitors when it pleased him. Arthur Clennam, with the card in his hand, betook himself to the address set forth upon it, and speedily arrived there. It was a very small establishment, wherein a decent woman sat behind the counter working at her needle. Little jars of tobacco, little boxes of cigars, little assortment of pipes, a little jar or two of snuff, and a little instrument like a shoeing horn for serving it out, composed the retail stock in trade. Arthur mentioned his name, and his having promised to call, on the solicitation of Mr. Chivery, about something relating to Miss Dorrit, he believed. Mrs. Chivery at once laid aside her work, rose up from her seat behind the counter, and deploringly shook her head. "You may see him now," said she, "if you will condescend to take a peep." With these mysterious words, she preceded the visitor into a little parlour behind the shop, with a little window in it commanding a very little dull backyard. In this yard a wash of sheets and tablecloth tried, in vain for want of air, to get itself dried on a line or two, and among these flapping articles was sitting in a chair, like the last mariner left alive on the deck of a damned ship without the power of furling the sails, a little woe-begone young man. "Our John," said Mrs. Chivery. Not to be deficient in interest, Clennam asked what he might be doing there. "It's the only change he takes," said Mrs. Chivery, shaking her head afresh. "He won't go out even in the backyard, when there's no linen. But when there's linen to keep the neighbours' eyes off, he'll sit there hours he will. says he feels as if it was Grove's." Mrs. Chivery shook her head again, put her apron in a motherly way to her eyes, and reconducted her visitor into the regions of the business. "Please to take a seat, sir," said Mrs. Chivery. "Miss Dorrit is the matter with our John, sir. He's a breaking his heart for her, and I would wish to take the liberty to ask how it's to be made good to his parents when buzzed." Mrs. Chivery was a comfortable-looking woman much respected about Horsemonger Lane for her feelings and her conversation, uttered this speech with fell composure, and immediately afterwards began again to shake her head and dry her eyes. "Sir," said she in continuation, "you are acquainted with the family, and have interested yourself with the family, and are influential with the family. If you can promote views calculated to make two young people happy, let me, for our John's sake, and for both their sakes, implore you so to do." "I have been so habituated," returned Arthur at a loss, "during the short time I have known her, to consider I have been so habituated to consider Miss Dorrit in a light altogether removed from that in which you present her to me, that you quite take me by surprise. Does she know your son?" "Brought up together, sir," said Mrs. Chivery. "Played together." "Does she know your son as her admirer?" "Oh, bless you, sir," said Mrs. Chivery with a sort of triumphant shiver, "she never could have seen him on a Sunday without knowing he was that. His cane alone would have told it long ago, if nothing else had. Young men like John don't take to ivory hands a-painting for nothing. How did I first know it myself? Similarly. Perhaps Miss Dorrit may not be so ready as you see." "Then she knows it, sir," said Mrs. Chivery, "by word of mouth." "Are you sure?" "Sir," said Mrs. Chivery, "sure and certain as in this house I am. I see my son go out with my own eyes when in this house I was, and I see my son come in with my own eyes when in this house I was, and I know he done it." Mrs. Chivery derived a surprising force of emphasis from the foregoing circumstantiality and repetition. "May I ask you how he came to fall into the desponding state which causes you so much uneasiness?" "That," said Mrs. Chivery, "took place on that same day when to this house I see that John with these eyes return. Never been himself in this house since, never was like what he has been since, not from the hour when to this house 7 year ago me and his father, as tenants by the quarter, came." An effect in the nature of an affidavit was gained from this speech by Mrs. Chivery's peculiar power of construction. "May I venture to inquire what is your version of the matter?" "You may," said Mrs. Chivery, "and I will give it to you in honour and in word as true as in this shop I stand. Our John has every one's good word and every one's good wish. He played with her as a child, when in that yard a child she played. He has known her ever since. He went out upon the Sunday afternoon when in this very parlour he had dined, and met her, with appointment or without appointment, which I do not pretend to say. He made his offer to her. Her brother and sister is high in their views, and against our John. Her father is all for himself in his views, and against sharing her with any one. Under which circumstances she has answered our John, 'No, John, I cannot have you. I cannot have any husband. It is not my intentions ever to become a wife. It is my intentions to be always a sacrifice. Farewell. Find another worthy of you, and forget me.' This is the way in which she is doomed to be a constant slave to them that are not worthy that a constant slave she unto them should be. This is the way in which our John has come to find no pleasure but in taking cold among the linen, and in showing in that yard, and in that yard I have myself shown you, a broken-down ruin that goes home to his mother's heart." Here the good woman pointed to the little window, whence her son might be seen sitting disconsolate in the tuneless groves, and again shook her head and wiped her eyes, and besought him, for the united sakes of both the young people, to exercise his influence towards the bright reversal of these dismal events. She was so confident in her exposition of the case, and it was so undeniably founded on correct premises, in so far as the relative positions of little Dorrit and her family were concerned, that Clennam could not feel positive on the other side. He had come to attach to little Dorrit an interest so peculiar, an interest that removed her from, while it grew out of, the common and coarse things surrounding her, that he found it disappointing, disagreeable, almost painful, to suppose her in love with young Mr. Chivery in the backyard, or any such person. On the other hand, he reasoned with himself that she was just as good and just as true in love with him as not in love with him, and that to make a kind of domesticated fairy of her, on the penalty of isolation at heart from the only people she knew, would be but a weakness of his own fancy, and not a kind one. Still, her youthful and ethereal appearance, her timid manner, the charm of her sensitive voice and eyes, the very many respects in which she had interested him out of her own individuality, and the strong difference between herself and those about her, were not in unison, and were determined not to be in unison, with this newly presented idea. He told the worthy Mrs. Chivery, after turning these things over in his mind, he did that indeed while she was yet speaking, that he might be relied upon to do his utmost at all times to promote the happiness of Miss Dorrit, and to further the wishes of her heart, if it were in his power to do so, and if he could discover what they were. At the same time he cautioned her against assumptions and appearances, enjoined strict silence and secrecy, lest Miss Dorrit should be made unhappy, and particularly advised her to endeavour to win her son's confidence, and so to make quite sure of the state of the case. Mrs. Chivery considered the latter precaution superfluous, but said she would try. She shook her head as if she had not derived all the comfort she had fondly expected from this interview, but thanked him nevertheless for the trouble he had kindly taken. They then parted good friends, and Arthur walked away. The crowd in the street jostling the crowd in his mind, and the two crowds making a confusion, he avoided London Bridge, and turned in the quieter direction of the Iron Bridge. He had scarcely set foot upon it, when he saw little Dorrit walking on before him. It was a pleasant day, with a light breeze blowing, and she seemed to have that minute come there for air. He had left her in her father's room within an hour. It was a timely chance, favourable to his wish of observing her face and manner when no one else was by. He quickened his pace, but before he reached her she turned her head. "Have I startled you?" he asked. "I thought I knew the step," she answered, hesitating. "And did you know it, little Dorrit? You could hardly have expected mine." "I did not expect any, but when I heard a step, I thought it sounded like yours." "Are you going further?" "No, sir. I am only walking here for a little change." They walked together, and she recovered her confiding manner with him, and looked up in his face as she said, after glancing around, "It is so strange. Perhaps you can hardly understand it. I sometimes have a sensation as if it was almost unfeeling to walk here." "Unfeeling?" "To see the river, and so much sky, and so many objects, and such change and motion, then to go back, you know, and find him in the same cramped place." "Oh, yes. But going back, you must remember that you take with you the spirit and influence of such things to cheer him." "Do I? I hope I may. I am afraid you fancy too much, sir, and make me out too powerful. If you were in prison, could I bring such comfort to you?" "Yes, little Dorrit, I am sure of it." He gathered from a tremor on her lip, and a passing shadow of great agitation on her face, that her mind was with her father. He remained silent for a few moments, that she might regain her composure. The little Dorrit, trembling on his arm, was less in unison than ever with Mrs. Chivery's theory, and yet was not irreconcilable with the new fancy which sprang up within him, that there might be some one else in the hopeless, newer fancy still, in the hopeless unattainable distance. They turned, and Clennam said, "Here was Maggie coming." Little Dorrit looked up, surprised, as they confronted Maggie, who brought herself at sight of them to a dead stop. She had been trotting along, so preoccupied and busy that she had not recognized them until they turned upon her. She was now in a moment so conscience-stricken that her very basket partook of the change. "Maggie, you promised me to stop near father." "So I would, little mother, only he wouldn't let me. If he takes and sends me out, I must go. If he takes and says, 'Maggie, you hurry away and back with that letter, and you shall have a sixpence if the answer is a good un,' I must take it. Lor, little mother, what's a poor thing of 10-year-old to do? And if Mr. Tip, if he happens to be a-coming in as I come out, and if he says, 'Where are you going, Maggie?' and if I says, 'I am a-going so-and-so,' and if he says, 'I'll have a try to,' and if he goes into the George and writes a letter, and if he gives it me and says, 'Take that one to the same place, and if the answer's a good un, I'll give you a shilling,' it ain't my fault, mother." Arthur read, in little Dorrit's downcast eyes, to whom she foresaw that the letters were addressed. "I'm a-going so-and-so. There, that's where I'm a-going to," said Maggie. "I'm a-going so-and-so. It ain't you, little mother, that's got anything to do with it. It's you, you know," said Maggie, addressing Arthur. "You'd better come, so-and-so, and let me take and give 'em to you." "We will not be so particular as that, Maggie. Give them me here," said Clennam in a low voice. "Well then, come across the road," answered Maggie in a very loud whisper. "Little mother wasn't to know nothing of it, and she would never have known nothing of it if you had only gone so-and-so, instead of bothering and loitering about. It ain't my fault. I must do what I am told. They ought to be ashamed of themselves for telling me." Clennam crossed to the other side, and hurriedly opened the letters. That from the father mentioned that most unexpectedly, finding himself in the novel position of having been disappointed of a remittance from the city, on which he had confidently counted, he took up his pen, being restrained by the unhappy circumstance of his incarceration during 23 years, doubly underlined, from coming himself, as he would otherwise certainly have done, took up his pen to entreat Mr. Clennam to advance him the sum of £3 10s upon his IOU, which he begged to enclose. That from the son set forth that Mr. Clennam would, he knew, be gratified to hear that he had at length obtained permanent employment of a highly satisfactory nature, accompanied with every prospect of complete success in life, but that the temporary inability of his employer to pay him his arrears of salary to that date, in which condition said employer had appealed to that generous forbearance in which he trusted he should never be wanting towards a fellow creature, combined with the fraudulent conduct of a false friend and the present high price of provisions, had reduced him to the verge of ruin, unless he could by 6:15 that evening raise the sum of £8. This sum, Mr. Clennam would be happy to learn, he had, through the promptitude of several friends who had a lively confidence in his probity, already raised, with the exception of a trifling balance of £1 17 and 4d, the loan of which balance, for the period of 1 month, would be fraught with the usual beneficent consequences. These letters Clennam answered with the aid of his pencil and pocket-book on the spot, sending the father what he asked for, and excusing himself from compliance with the demand of the son. He then commissioned Maggie to return with his replies, and gave her the shilling of which the failure of her supplemental enterprise would have disappointed her otherwise. When he rejoined little Dorrit, and they had begun walking as before, she said all at once, "I think I had better go. I had better go home." "Don't be distressed," said Clennam. "I have answered the letters. They were nothing. You know what they were. They were nothing." "But I am afraid," she returned, "to leave him. I am afraid to leave any of them. When I am gone, they pervert, but they don't mean it, even Maggie." It was a very innocent commission that she undertook, poor thing, and in keeping it secret from you, she supposed, no doubt, that she was only saving your uneasiness. "Yes, I hope so, but I had better go home. It was but the other day that my sister told me that I had become so used to the prison that I had its tone and character. It must be so. I am sure it must be when I see these things. My place is there. I am better there. It is unfeeling in me to be here, when I can do the least thing there. Good-bye. I had far better stay at home." The agonized way in which she poured this out, as if it burst of itself from her suppressed heart, made it difficult for Clennam to keep the tears from his eyes as he saw and heard her. "Don't call it home, my child," he entreated. "It is always painful to me to hear you call it home." "But it is home. What else can I call home? Why should I ever forget it for a single moment?" "You never do, dear little Dorrit, in any good and true service." "I hope not. Oh, I hope not. But it is better for me to stay there. Much better, much more dutiful, much happier. Please, don't go with me. Let me go by myself. Good-bye. God bless you. Thank you. Thank you." He felt that it was better to respect her entreaty, and did not move while her slight form went quickly away from him. When it had fluttered out of sight, he turned his face towards the water and stood thinking. She would have been distressed at any time by this discovery of the letters, but so much so, and in that unrestrainable way? No. When she had seen her father begging with his threadbare disguise on, when she had entreated him not to give her father money, she had been distressed, but not like this. Something had made her keenly and additionally sensitive just now. Now, was there someone in the hopeless, unattainable distance? Or had the suspicion been brought into his mind by his own associations of the troubled river running beneath the bridge, with the same river higher up, its changeless tune upon the prow of the ferry-boat, so many miles an hour the peaceful flowing of the stream, here the rushes, there the lilies, nothing uncertain or unquiet? He thought of his poor child, little Dorrit, for a long time there. He thought of her going home. He thought of her in the night. He thought of her when the day came round again. And the poor child, little Dorrit, thought of him, too faithfully, too faithfully, in the shadow of the Marshalsea wall. End of chapter the 22nd, book the 1st. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter the 23rd, book the 1st of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Alice Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Book the 1st. Chapter the 23rd. Machinery in Motion. Mr. Meagles bestirred himself with such prompt activity in the matter of the negotiation with Daniel Doyce which Clennam had entrusted to him, that he soon brought it into business train, and called on Clennam at 9 o'clock one morning to make his report. "Doyce is highly gratified by your good opinion," he opened the business by saying, "and desires nothing so much as that you should examine the affairs of the works for yourself, and entirely understand them. He has handed me the keys of all his books and papers. Here they are jingling in his pocket, and the only charge he has given me is, let Mr. Clennam have the means of putting himself on a perfect equality with me as to knowing whatever I know. If it should come to nothing after all, he will respect my confidence. Unless I was sure of that to begin with, I should have nothing to do with him. And there you see," said Mr. Meagles, "you have Daniel Doyce all over. A very honourable character. Oh yes, to be sure, not a doubt of it. Odd, but very honourable. Very odd, though. Now, would you believe, Clennam," said Mr. Meagles, with a hearty enjoyment of his friend's eccentricity, "that I had a whole morning in what's-his-name yard, Bleeding Heart, a whole morning in Bleeding Heart yard, before I could induce him to pursue the subject at all." "How was that?" "How was that, my friend? I no sooner mentioned your name in connection with it than he declared off." "Declared off on my account?" "I no sooner mentioned your name, Clennam, than he said, 'That will never do.' What did he mean by that? I asked him. No matter, Meagles. That would never do. Why would it never do? You'll hardly believe it, Clennam," said Mr. Meagles, laughing within himself, "but it came out that it would never do because you and he, walking down to Twickenham together, had glided into a friendly conversation in the course of which he had referred to his intention of taking a partner, supposing at the time that you were as firmly and finally settled as St. Paul's Cathedral. Whereas, says he, Mr. Clennam might now believe, if I entertained his proposition, that I had a sinister and designing motive in what was open free speech, which I can't bear, says he, which I really am too proud to bear. I should as soon suspect— Of course you would, interrupted Mr. Meagles, and so I told him, but it took a morning to scale that wall, and I doubt if any other man than myself, he likes me of old, could have got his leg over it. Well, Clennam, this business-like obstacle surmounted, he then stipulated that before resuming with you, I should look over the books and form my own opinion. I looked over the books, and formed my own opinion. Is it on the whole for or against? Says he. For, says I. Then, says he, you may now, my good friend, give Mr. Clennam the means of forming his opinion, to enable him to do which, without bias and with perfect freedom, I shall go out of town for a week. And he's gone, said Mr. Meagles. That's the rich conclusion of the thing. Leaving me, said Clennam, with a high sense, I must say, of his candour and his oddity. Mr. Meagles struck in. I should think so. It was not exactly the word on Clennam's lips, but he forbore to interrupt his good-humoured friend. And now, added Mr. Meagles, you can begin to look into matters as soon as you think proper. I have undertaken to explain where you may want explanation, but to be strictly impartial, and to do nothing more. They began their perquisitions in Bleeding Heart Yard that same forenoon. Little peculiarities were easily to be detected by experienced eyes in Mr. Joyce's way of managing his affairs, but they almost always involved some ingenious simplification of a difficulty, and some plain road to the desired end. That his papers were in arrear, and that he stood in need of assistance to develop the capacity of his business, was clear enough. But all the results of his undertakings during many years were distinctly set forth, and were ascertainable with ease. Nothing had been done for the purposes of the pending investigation. Everything was in its genuine working dress, and in a certain honest rugged order. The calculations and entries, in his own hand, of which there were many, were bluntly written, and with no very neat precision, but were always plain and directed straight to the purpose. It occurred to Arthur that a far more elaborate and taking show of business, such as the records of the Circumlocution Office made perhaps, might be far less serviceable, as being meant to be far less intelligible. 3 or 4 days of steady application tendered him master of all the facts it was essential to become acquainted with. Mr. Meagles was at hand the whole time, always ready to illuminate any dim place with a bright little safety lamp belonging to the scales and scoop. Between them, they agreed upon the sum it would be fair to offer for the purchase of a half-share in the business, and then Mr. Meagles unsealed a paper in which Daniel Joyce had noted the amount at which he valued it, which was even something less. Thus, when Daniel came back, he found the affair as good as concluded. "And I may now avow, Mr. Clennam," said he, with a cordial shake of the hand, "that if I had looked high and low for a partner, I believe I could not have found one more to my mind." "I say the same," said Clennam. "And I say of both of you," added Mr. Meagles, "that you are well matched. You keep him in check, Clennam, with your common sense, and you stick to the works, Dan, with your uncommon sense," suggested Daniel with his quiet smile. "You may call it so, if you like, and each of you will be a right hand to the other. Here is my own right hand upon it, as a practical man to both of you." The purchase was completed within a month. It left Arthur in possession of private personal means not exceeding a few £100, but it opened to him an active and promising career. The 3 friends dined together on the auspicious occasion. The factory and the factory wives and children made holiday and dined too. Even Bleeding Heart Yard dined, and was full of meat. 2 months had barely gone by in all, when Bleeding Heart Yard had become so familiar with short commons again, that the treat was forgotten there, when nothing seemed new in the partnership but the paint of the inscription on the door-posts, Doyce and Clennam, when it appeared even to Clennam himself that he had had the affairs of the firm in his mind for years. The little counting-house reserved for his own occupation was a room of wood and glass at the end of a long, low workshop, filled with benches, and vices, and tools, and straps, and wheels, which, when they were in gear with the steam engine, went tearing round as though they had a suicidal mission to grind the business to dust and tear the factory to pieces. A communication of great trapdoors in the floor and roof with the workshop above and the workshop below made a shaft of light in this perspective, which brought to Clennam's mind the child's old picture book, where similar rays were the witnesses of Abel's murder. The noises were sufficiently removed and shut out from the counting-house to blend into a busy hum, interspersed with periodical clinks and thumps. The patient figures at work were swarthy with the filings of iron and steel that danced on every bench and bubbled up through every chink in the planking. The workshop was arrived at by a step-ladder from the outer yard below, where it served as a shelter for the large grindstone where tools were sharpened. The whole had at once a fanciful and practical air in Clennam's eyes, which was a welcome change, and as often as he raised them from his first work of getting the array of business documents into perfect order, he glanced at these things with a feeling of pleasure in his pursuit that was new to him. Raising his eyes thus one day, he was surprised to see a bonnet labouring up the step-ladder. The unusual apparition was followed by another bonnet. He then perceived that the first bonnet was on the head of Mr. F. Sant, and that the second bonnet was on the head of Flora, who seemed to have propelled her legacy up the steep ascent with considerable difficulty. Though not altogether enraptured at the sight of these visitors, Clennam lost no time in opening the counting-house door, and extricating them from the workshop, a rescue which was rendered the more necessary by Mr. F. Sant already stumbling over some impediment, and menacing steam power as an institution with the stony reticule she carried. "Good gracious, Arthur! I should say Mr. Clennam far more proper. The climb we have had to get up here, and how ever to get down again, without a fire escape, and Mr. F. Sant slipping through the steps and bruised all over, and you in the machinery and foundry way to only think, and never told us." Thus Flora, out of breath. Meanwhile Mr. F. Sant rubbed her esteemed insteps with her umbrella, and vindictively glared. "Most unkind never to have come back to see us since that day, though naturally it was not to be expected that there should be any attraction at our house, and you were much more pleasantly engaged, that's pretty certain. And is she fair, or dark blue eyes, or black, I wonder? Not that I expect that she should be anything but a perfect contrast to me, in all particulars, for I am a disappointment, as I very well know, and you are quite right to be devoted, no doubt, though what I am saying, Arthur, never mind, I hardly know myself, good gracious." By this time he had placed chairs for them in the counting-house. As Flora dropped into hers, she bestowed the old look upon him. "And to think of Doyce and Clennam, and who Doyce can be," said Flora. "Delightful man, no doubt, and married, perhaps, or perhaps a daughter. Now has he really? The one understands the partnership and sees it all. Don't tell me anything about it, for I know I have no claim to ask the question, the golden chain that once was forged being snapped, and very proper." Flora put her hand tenderly on his, and gave him another of the youthful glances. "Dear Arthur, force of habit, Mr. Clennam, every way more delicate and adapted to existing circumstances. I must beg to be excused for taking the liberty of this intrusion, but I thought I might so far presume upon old times for ever faded never more to bloom, as to call with Mr. F. Sant to congratulate and offer best wishes, a great deal superior to China, not to be denied, and much nearer, though higher up." "I am very happy to see you," said Clennam, "and I thank you, Flora, very much for your kind remembrance." "More than I can say myself at any rate," returned Flora. for I might have been dead and buried 20 distinct times over, and no doubt whatever should have been before you had genuinely remembered me, or anything like it, in spite of which one last remark I wish to make, one last explanation I wish to offer." "My dear Mrs. Finching," Arthur remonstrated in alarm. "Oh, not that disagreeable name. Say Flora." "Flora, is it worth troubling yourself afresh to enter into explanations? I assure you none are needed. I am satisfied. I am perfectly satisfied." A diversion was occasioned here by Mr. F.'s aunt making the following inexorable and awful statement: "There's milestones on the Dover road." With such mortal hostility towards the human race did she discharge this missile, that Clennam was quite at a loss how to defend himself, the rather as he had been already perplexed in his mind by the honour of a visit from this venerable lady, when it was plain she held him in the utmost abhorrence. He could not but look at her with disconcertment, as she sat breathing bitterness and scorn, and staring leagues away. Flora, however, received the remark as if it had been of a most apposite and agreeable nature, approvingly observing aloud that Mr. F.'s aunt had a great deal of spirit. Stimulated either by this compliment or by her burning indignation, that illustrious woman then added, "Let him meet it if he can," and, with a rigid movement of her stony reticule, an appendage of great size and of a fossil appearance, indicated that Clennam was the unfortunate person at whom the challenge was hurled. "One last remark," resumed Flora. "I was going to say I wish to make one last explanation I wish to offer. Mr. F.'s aunt and myself would not have intruded on business hours, Mr. F. having been in business, and though the wine trade still business is equally business, call it what you will, and business habits are just the same, as witness Mr. F. himself, who had his slippers always on the mat at 10 minutes before 6 in the afternoon, and his boots inside the fender at 10 minutes before 8 in the morning, to the moment, in all weathers, light or dark, would not therefore have intruded without a motive, which being kindly meant, it may be hoped, will be kindly taken, Arthur, Mr. Clennam far more proper, even Joyce and Clennam probably more business-like." "Pray say nothing in the way of apology," Arthur entreated. "You are always welcome." "Very polite of you to say so, Arthur. I cannot remember Mr. Clennam until the word is out. Such is the habit of times for ever fled, and so true it is that oft in the stilly night ere slumber's chain has bound people, fond memory brings the light of other days around people. Very polite, but more polite than true, I am afraid, for to go into the machinery business without so much as sending a line or a card to papa, I don't say me, though there was a time, but that's past, and stern reality has now, my gracious never mind, does not look like it, you must confess." Even Flora's commerce seemed to have fled on this occasion. She was so much more disjointed and voluble than in the preceding interview. "Though, indeed," she hurried on, "nothing else is to be expected, and why should it be expected, and if it's not to be expected, why should it be, and I am far from blaming you or any one. When your mamma and my papa worried us to death and severed the golden bowl, I mean bond, but I dare say you know what I mean, and if you don't lose much and care just as little, I will venture to add. When they severed the golden bond that bound us and threw us into fits of crying on the sofa, nearly choked at least myself, everything was changed, and in giving my hand to Mr. F., I know I did so with my eyes open, but he was so very unsettled, and in such low spirits, that he had distractedly alluded to the river, if not oil of something from the chemist's, and I did it for the best." "My good Flora, we settled that before. It was all quite right." "It's perfectly clear you think so," returned Flora, "for you take it very coldly. If I hadn't known it to be China, I should have guessed myself the polar regions. Dear Mr. Clennam, you are right, however, and I cannot blame you, but as to Joyce and Clennam papa's property being about here, we heard it from Pangs, and but for him we never should have heard one word about it, I am satisfied." No, don't say that. What nonsense not to say it, Arthur. Joyce and Clennam easier and less trying to me than Mr. Clennam, when I know it, and you know it too, and can't deny it. "But I do deny it, Flora. I should soon have made you a friendly visit." "Ah!" said Flora, tossing her head. "I dare say," and she gave him another of the old looks. However, when Panks told us, I made up my mind that Mr. F.'s aunt and I would come and call, because when Papa, which was before that, happened to mention her name to me, and to say that you were interested in her, I said at the moment, good gracious, why not have her here then, when there's anything to do instead of putting it out? When you say her, observed Clennam, by this time pretty well bewildered, do you mean Mr. F.'s? My goodness, Arthur! Doyce and Clennam really easier to me, with old remembrances. Who ever heard of Mr. F.'s aunt doing needlework and going out by the day? Going out by the day? Do you speak of little Dorrit? Why, yes, of course, returned Flora. And of all the strangest names, I ever heard the strangest, like a place down in the country with a turnpike, or a favourite pony, or a puppy, or a bird, or something from a seed shop to be put in a garden or a flower pot and come up speckled. Then, Flora, said Arthur with a sudden interest in the conversation, Mr. Casby was so kind as to mention little Dorrit to you, was he? What did he say? Oh, you know what Papa is, rejoined Flora, and how aggravatingly he sits looking beautiful and turning his thumbs over and over one another till he makes one giddy if one keeps one's eyes upon him. He said when we were talking of you, I don't know who began the subject, Arthur, Doyce and Clennam, but I am sure it wasn't me. At least I hope not, but you really must excuse my confessing more on that point. Certainly, said Arthur, by all means. You are very ready, pouted Flora, coming to a sudden stop in a captivating bashfulness, that I must admit Papa said you had spoken of her in an earnest way, and I said what I have told you, and that's all. That's all? Said Arthur, a little disappointed. Except that when Panks told us of your having embarked in this business, and with difficulty persuaded us that it was really you, I said to Mr. F.'s aunt, then we would come and ask you if it would be agreeable to all parties that she should be engaged at our house when required, for I know she often goes to your mamma's, and I know that your mamma has a very touchy temper, Arthur, Doyce and Clennam, or I never might have married Mr. F., and might have been at this hour, but I am running into nonsense. It was very kind of you, Flora, to think of this. Poor Flora rejoined with a plain sincerity, which became her better than her youngest glances, that she was glad he thought so. She said it with so much heart, that Clennam would have given a great deal to buy his old character of her on the spot, and throw it and the mermaid away for ever. I think, Flora, he said, that the employment you can give little Dorrit, and the kindness you can show her— Yes, and I will, said Flora quickly. I am sure of it, will be a great assistance and support to her. I do not feel that I have the right to tell you what I know of her, for I acquired the knowledge confidentially, and under circumstances that bind me to silence. But I have an interest in the little creature, and a respect for her that I cannot express to you. Her life has been one of such trial and devotion, and such quiet goodness, as you can scarcely imagine. I can hardly think of her, far less speak of her, without feeling moved. Let that feeling represent what I could tell you, and commit her to your friendliness with my thanks. Once more he put out his hand frankly to poor Flora. Once more poor Flora couldn't accept it frankly, found it worth nothing openly, must make the old intrigue and mystery of it, as much to her own enjoyment as to his dismay. She covered it with a corner of her shawl as she took it. Then, looking towards the glass front of the counting-house, and seeing two figures approaching, she cried with infinite relish, "Papa! Hush, Arthur, for mercy's sake!" and tottered back to her chair with an amazing imitation of being in danger of swooning, in the dread surprise and maidenly flutter of her spirits. The patriarch, meanwhile, came inanely beaming towards the counting-house in the wake of Panks. Panks opened the door for him, towed him in, and retired to his own moorings in a corner. "I heard from Flora," said the patriarch with his benevolent smile, "that she was coming to call, and being out, I thought I'd come also. The benign wisdom he infused into this declaration, not of itself profound, by means of his blue eyes, his shining head, and his long white hair, was most impressive. It seemed worth putting down among the noblest sentiments enunciated by the best of men. Also, when he said to Clennam, seating himself in the proffered chair, "And you're in a new business, Mr. Clennam? I wish you well, sir, I wish you well." He seemed to have done benevolent wonders. "Mrs. Finching has been telling me, sir," said Arthur, after making his acknowledgments, the relict of the late Mr. F. meanwhile protesting with a gesture against his use of that respectable name, "that she hopes occasionally to employ the young needlewoman you recommended to my mother, for which I have been thanking her." The patriarch turning his head in a lumbering way towards Panks, that assistant put up the note-book in which he had been absorbed, and took him in tow. "You didn't recommend her, you know," said Panks. "How could you? You knew nothing about her, you didn't. The name was mentioned to you, and you passed it on. That's what you did." "Well," said Clennam, "as she justifies any recommendation, it is much the same thing." "You are glad she turns out well," said Panks, "but it wouldn't have been your fault if she had turned out ill. The credit's not yours, as it is, and the blame wouldn't have been yours, as it might have been. You gave no guarantee. You knew nothing about her." "You are not acquainted, then," said Arthur, hazarding a random question, "with any of her family?" "Acquainted with any of her family?" returned Panks. "How should you be acquainted with any of her family? You never heard of 'em. You can't be acquainted with people you never heard of, can you? You should think not." All this time the patriarch sat serenely smiling, nodding or shaking his head benevolently, as the case required. "As to being a reference," said Panks, "you know, in a general way, what being a reference means. It's all your rye, that is. Look at your tenants down the yard here. They'd all be references for one another, if you'd let 'em. What would be the good of letting 'em? It's no satisfaction to be done by two men instead of one. One's enough. A person who can't pay gets another person who can't pay to guarantee that he can pay, like a person with two wooden legs getting another person with two wooden legs to guarantee that he has two natural legs. It don't make either of them able to do a walking match, and 4 wooden legs are more troublesome to you than 2, when you don't want any." Mr. Panks concluded by blowing off that steam of his. A momentary silence that ensued was broken by Mr. F.'s aunt, who had been sitting upright in a cataleptic state since her last public remark. She now underwent a violent twitch, calculated to produce a startling effect on the nerves of the uninitiated, and with the deadliest animosity observed, "You can't make a head and brains out of a brass knob with nothing in it. You couldn't do it when your Uncle George was living, much less when he's dead." Mr. Panks was not slow to reply with his usual calmness. "Indeed, ma'am, bless my soul, I'm surprised to hear it." Despite his presence of mind, however, the speech of Mr. F.'s aunt produced a depressing effect on the little assembly. Firstly, because it was impossible to disguise that Clennam's unoffending head was the particular temple of reason depreciated; and secondly, because nobody ever knew on these occasions whose Uncle George was referred to, or what spectral presence might be invoked under that appellation. Therefore Flora said, though still not without a certain boastfulness and triumph in her legacy, that Mr. F.'s aunt was very lively to-day, and she thought they had better go. But Mr. F.'s aunt proved so lively as to take the suggestion in unexpected dudgeon and declare that she would not go, adding, with several injurious expressions, that if he, too evidently meaning Clennam, wanted to get rid of her, let him chuck her out of window, and urgently expressing her desire to see him perform that ceremony. In this dilemma Mr. Panks, whose resources appeared equal to any emergency in the patriarchal waters, slipped on his hat, slipped out at the counting-house door, and slipped in again a moment afterwards with an artificial freshness upon him, as if he had been in the country for some weeks. "Why, bless my heart, ma'am," said Mr. Panks, rubbing up his hair in great astonishment, "is that you? How do you do, ma'am? You're looking charming to-day. I am delighted to see you. Favour me with your arm, ma'am. We'll have a little walk together, you and me, if you'll honour me with your company." and so escorted Mr. F.'s aunt down the private staircase of the counting-house with great gallantry and success. The patriarchal Mr. Casby then rose with the air of having done it himself, and blandly followed, leaving his daughter, as she followed in her turn, to remark to her former lover in a distracted whisper, which she very much enjoyed, that they had drained the cup of life to the dregs, and further to hint mysteriously that the late Mr. F. was at the bottom of it. Alone again, Clennam became a prey to his old doubts in reference to his mother and little Dorrit, and revolved the old thoughts and suspicions. They were all in his mind, blending themselves with the duties he was mechanically discharging, when a shadow on his papers caused him to look up for the cause. The cause was Mr. Panks. With his hat thrown back upon his ears, as if his wiry prongs of hair had darted up like springs and cast it off, with his jet-black beads of eyes inquisitively sharp, with the fingers of his right hand in his mouth that he might bite the nails, and with the fingers of his left hand in reserve in his pocket for another cause, Mr. Panks cast his shadow through the glass upon the books and papers. Mr. Panks asked, with a little inquiring twist of his head, if he might come in again. Clennam replied with a nod of his head in the affirmative. Mr. Panks worked his way in, came alongside the desk, made himself fast by leaning his arms upon it, and started conversation with a puff and a snort. "Mr. F.'s aunt is appeased, I hope," said Clennam. "All right, sir," said Panks. "I am so unfortunate as to have awakened a strong animosity in the breast of that lady," said Clennam. "Do you know why?" "Does she know why?" said Panks. "I suppose not." "I suppose not," said Panks. He took out his note-book, opened it, shut it, dropped it into his hat, which was beside him on the desk, and looked in at it as it lay at the bottom of the hat, all with a great appearance of consideration. "Mr. Clennam," he then began, "I am in want of information, sir." "Connected with this firm?" asked Clennam. "No," said Panks. "With what then, Mr. Panks? That is to say, assuming that you want it of me." "Yes, sir, yes, I want it of you," said Panks. "If I can persuade you to furnish it, A, B, C, D, D, A, D, E, D, I, D, O, a dictionary order. Dorrit? That's the name, sir." Mr. Panks blew off his peculiar noise again, and fell to at his right-hand nails. Arthur looked searchingly at him. He returned the look. "I don't understand you, Mr. Panks." "That's the name that I want to know about." "And what do you want to know?" "Whatever you can and will tell me." This comprehensive summary of his desires was not discharged without some heavy labouring on the part of Mr. Panks' machinery. "This is a singular visit, Mr. Panks. It strikes me as rather extraordinary that you should come, with such an object, to me." "It may be all extraordinary together," returned Panks. "It may be out of the ordinary course, and yet be business. In short, it is business. I am a man of business. What business have I in this present world, except to stick to business? No business." With his former doubt whether this dry, hard personage were quite in earnest, Clennam again turned his eyes attentively upon his face. It was as scrubby and dingy as ever, and as eager and quick as ever, and he could see nothing lurking in it that was at all expressive of a latent mockery that had seemed to strike upon his ear in the voice. "Now," said Panks, "to put this business on its own footing, it's not my proprietor's." "Do you refer to Mr. Casby as your proprietor?" Panks nodded. "My proprietor. Put a case. Say, at my proprietor's I hear name of young person Mr. Clennam wants to serve. Say, name first mentioned to my proprietor by Plornish in the yard. Say, I go to Plornish. Say, I ask Plornish as a matter of business for information. Say, Plornish, though 6 weeks in arrear to my proprietor, declines. Say, Mrs. Plornish declines. Say, both refer to Mr. Clennam. Put the case." "Well?" "Well, sir," returned Panks, Say, I come to him. Say, here I am. With those prongs of hair sticking up all over his head, and his breath coming and going very hard and short, the busy Panks fell back a step, in tag metaphor, took half a turn astern, as if to show his dingy hull complete, then forged ahead again, and directed his quick glance by turns into his hat where his note-book was, and into Clennam's face. Mr. Panks, not to trespass on your grounds of mystery, I will be as plain with you as I can. Let me ask 2 questions. First. All right, said Panks, holding up his dirty forefinger with his broken nail. I see. What's your motive? Exactly. Motive, said Panks. Good. Nothing to do with my proprietor. Not stateable at present, ridiculous to state at present, but good. Desiring to serve young person name of Dorrit, said Panks, with his forefinger still up as a caution. Better admit motive to be good. Secondly, and lastly, what do you want to know? Mr. Panks fished up his note-book before the question was put, and buttoning it with care in an inner breast pocket, and looking straight at Clennam all the time, replied with a pause and a puff. I want supplementary information of any sort. Clennam could not withhold a smile, as the panting little steam tug, so useful to that unwieldy ship, the Casby, waited on and watched him as if it were seeking an opportunity of running in and rifling him of all he wanted before he could resist its manoeuvres. Though there was that in Mr. Panks's eagerness, too, which awakened many wondering speculations in his mind. After a little consideration, he resolved to supply Mr. Panks with such leading information as it was in his power to impart him, well knowing that Mr. Panks, if he failed in his present research, was pretty sure to find other means of getting it. He, therefore, first requesting Mr. Panks to remember his voluntary declaration that his proprietor had no part in the disclosure, and that his own intentions were good, 2 declarations which that coaly little gentleman with the greatest ardour repeated, openly told him, that as to the Dorrit lineage or former place of habitation, he had no information to communicate, and that his knowledge of the family did not extend beyond the fact that it appeared to be now reduced to 5 members, namely, to 2 brothers, of whom one was single, and one a widower with 3 children. The ages of the whole family he made known to Mr. Panks as nearly as he could guess at them, and finally he described to him the position of the father of the Marshalsea, and the course of time and events through which he had become invested with that character. To all this, Mr. Panks, snorting and blowing in a more and more portentous manner, as he became more interested, listened with great attention, appearing to derive the most agreeable sensations from the painfullest parts of the narrative, and particularly to be quite charmed by the account of William Dorrit's long imprisonment. In conclusion, Mr. Panks, said Arthur, I have but to say this. I have reasons beyond a personal regard for speaking as little as I can of the Dorrit family, particularly at my mother's house. Mr. Panks nodded. And for knowing as much as I can. So devoted a man of business as you are, eh? For Mr. Panks had suddenly made that blowing effort with unusual force. It's nothing, said Panks. So devoted a man of business as yourself has a perfect understanding of a fair bargain. I wish to make a fair bargain with you, that you shall enlighten me concerning the Dorrit family when you have it in your power, as I have enlightened you. It may not give you a very flattering idea of my business habits, that I failed to make my terms beforehand, continued Clennam, but I prefer to make them a point of honour. I have seen so much business done on sharp principles that, to tell you the truth, Mr. Panks, I am tired of them. Mr. Panks laughed. It's a bargain, sir, said he. You shall find me stick to it. After that, he stood a little while looking at Clennam, and biting his 10 nails all round, evidently while he fixed in his mind what he had been told, and went over it carefully before the means of supplying a gap in his memory should be no longer at hand. It's all right, he said at last, and now I'll wish you good day. as it's collecting day in the yard. By the by, though, a lame foreigner with a stick. Ay, ay, you do take a reference sometimes, I see, said Clennam. When he can pay, sir, replied Panks. Take all you can get, and keep back all you can't be forced to give up. That's business. The lame foreigner with the stick wants a top room down the yard. Is he good for it? I am, said Clennam, and I will answer for him. That's enough. What I must have of Bleeding Heart Yard, said Panks, making a note of the case in his book, is my bond. I want my bond, you see. Pay up or produce your property. That's the watchword down the yard. The lame foreigner with the stick represented that you sent him, but he could represent, as far as that goes, that the Great Mogul sent him. He has been in the hospital, I believe? Yes, through having met with an accident. He is only just now discharged. It's pauperizing a man, sir, I have been shown, to let him into a hospital, said Panks, and again blew off that remarkable sound. I have been shown so too, said Clennam coldly. Mr. Panks, being by that time quite ready for a start, got under steam in a moment, and, without any other signal or ceremony, was snorting down the step-ladder and working into Bleeding Heart Yard before he seemed to be well out of the counting-house. Throughout the remainder of the day, Bleeding Heart Yard was in consternation, as the grim Panks cruised in it, haranguing the inhabitants on their backslidings in respect of payment, demanding his bond, breathing notices to quit and executions, running down defaulters, sending a swell of terror on before him, and leaving it in his wake. Knots of people, impelled by a fatal attraction, lurked outside any house in which he was known to be, listening for fragments of his discourses to the inmates, and, when he was rumoured to be coming down the stairs, often could not disperse so quickly but that he would be prematurely in among them, demanding their own arrears, and rooting them to the spot. Throughout the remainder of the day, Mr. Panks's "What were they up to?" and "What did they mean by it?" sounded all over the yard. Mr. Panks wouldn't hear of excuses, wouldn't hear of complaints, wouldn't hear of repairs, wouldn't hear of anything but unconditional money down. Perspiring and puffing and darting about in eccentric directions, and becoming hotter and dingier every moment, he lashed the tide of the yard into a most agitated and turbid state. It had not settled down into calm water again full 2 hours after he had been seen fuming away on the horizon at the top of the steps. There were several small assemblages of the Bleeding Hearts at the popular points of meeting in the yard that night, among whom it was universally agreed that Mr. Panks was a hard man to have to do with, and that it was much to be regretted, so it was, that a gentleman like Mr. Casby should put his rents in his hands, and never know him in his true light. For, said the Bleeding Hearts, if a gentleman with that head of hair and them eyes took his rents into his own hands, ma'am, there would be none of this worriting and wearing, and things would be very different. At which identical evening hour and minute, the patriarch, who had floated serenely through the yard in the forenoon before the harrying began, with the express design of getting up distrustfulness in his shining bumps and silken locks, at which identical hour and minute, that first-rate humbug of 1,000 guns was heavily floundering in the little dock of his exhausted tug at home, and was saying, as he turned his thumbs, "A very bad day's work, Panks, very bad day's work. It seems to me, sir, and I must insist on making this observation forcibly in justice to myself, that you ought to have got much more money, much more money." End of chapter the 23rd, book the 1st. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter the 24th, book the 1st, of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Alice Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Book the 1st, chapter the 24th, Fortune-telling. Little Dorrit received a call that same evening from Mr. Plornish, who, having intimated that he wished to speak to her privately, in a series of coughs so very noticeable as to favour the idea that her father, as regarded her seamstress occupation, was an illustration of the axiom that there are no such stone-blind men as those who will not see, obtained an audience with her on the common staircase outside the door. "There's been a lady at our place to-day, Miss Dorrit," Plornish growled, "and another one along with her, as is a old vixen if ever I met with such. The way she snapped a person's head off, dear me!" The mild Plornish was at first quite unable to get his mind away from Mr. F.'s aunt, "for," said he to excuse himself, "she is, I do assure you, the winegariest party." At length, by a great effort, he detached himself from the subject sufficiently to observe, "But she's neither here nor there just at present. The other lady, she's Mr. Casby's daughter, and if Mr. Casby aren't well off, none better, it ain't through any fault of Pank's. For, as to Pank's, he really does, he does indeed." Mr. Plornish, after his usual manner, was a little obscure, but conscientiously emphatic. "And what she come to our place for," he pursued, "was to leave word that if Miss Dorrit would step up to that card, which it's Mr. Casby's house, that is, and Pank's he has a office at the back, where he really does, beyond belief, she would be glad for to engage her. She was a old and a dear friend, she said particular, of Mr. Clennam, and hoped for to prove herself a useful friend to his friend. Them was her words. Wishing to know whether Miss Dorrit could come to-morrow morning, I said I would see you, miss, and inquire, and look round there to-night, to say yes, or, if you was engaged to-morrow, when." "I can go to-morrow, thank you," said little Dorrit. "This is very kind of you, but you're always kind." Mr. Plornish, with a modest disavowal of his merits, opened the room door for her readmission, and followed her in with such an exceedingly bold pretence of not having been out at all, that her father might have observed it without being very suspicious. In his affable unconsciousness, however, he took no heed. Plornish, after a little conversation in which he blended his former duty as a collegian with his present privilege as a humble outside friend, qualified again by his low estate as a plasterer, took his leave, making the tour of the prison before he left, and looking on at a game of skittles, with the mixed feelings of an old inhabitant who had his private reasons for believing that it might be his destiny to come back again. Early in the morning, little Dorrit, leaving Maggie in high domestic trust, set off for the patriarchal tent. She went by the iron bridge, though it cost her a penny, and walked more slowly in that part of her journey than in any other. At 5 minutes before 8, her hand was on the patriarchal knocker, which was quite as high as she could reach. She gave Mrs. Finching's card to the young woman who opened the door, and the young woman told her that Miss Flora having on her return to the parental roof, reinvested herself with the title under which she had lived there, was not yet out of her bedroom, but she was too pleased to walk up into Miss Flora's sitting-room. She walked up into Miss Flora's sitting-room, as in duty bound, and there found a breakfast-table comfortably laid for two, with a supplementary tray upon it laid for one. The young woman, disappearing for a few moments, returned to say that she was to please to take a chair by the fire, and to take off her bonnet, and make herself at home. But little Dorrit, being bashful, and not used to make herself at home on such occasions, felt at a loss how to do it. So she was still sitting near the door with her bonnet on, when Flora came in a hurry half an hour afterwards. Flora was so sorry to have kept her waiting, and good gracious, why did she sit out there in the cold when she had expected to find her by the fire reading the paper, and hadn't that heedless girl given her the message then, and had she really been in her bonnet all this time, and pray for goodness' sake let Flora take it off. Flora, taking it off in the best-natured manner in the world, was so struck with the face disclosed, that she said, "Why, "What a good little thing you are, my dear!" and pressed her face between her hands, like the gentlest of women. It was the word and the action of a moment. Little Dorrit had hardly time to think how kind it was, when Flora dashed at the breakfast table full of business, and plunged over head and ears into loquacity. "Really so sorry that I should happen to be late on this morning of all mornings, because my intention and my wish was to be ready to meet you when you came in, and to say that any one that interested Arthur Clennam half so much must interest me, and that I gave you the heartiest welcome and was so glad, instead of which they never called me, and there I still am, snoring, I dare say, if the truth was known, and if you don't like either cold fowl or hot-boiled ham, which many people don't, I dare say, besides Jews, and theirs are scruples of conscience, which we must all respect, though I must say I wish they had them equally strong when they sell us false articles for real, that certainly ain't worth the money. I shall be quite vexed," said Flora. Little Dorrit thanked her, and said, shyly, bread and butter and tea was all she usually— "Oh, nonsense, my dear child, I can never hear of that," said Flora, turning on the urn in the most reckless manner, and making herself wink by splashing hot water into her eyes as she bent down to look into the teapot. "You are coming here on the footing of a friend and companion, you know, if you will let me take that liberty, and I should be ashamed of myself indeed if you could come here upon any other, besides which Arthur Clennam spoke in such terms. You are tired, my dear?" "No, ma'am. You turn so pale you have walked too far before breakfast, and I dare say you live a great way off, and ought to have had a ride," said Flora. "Dear, dear, is there anything that would do you good?" "Indeed, I am quite well, ma'am. I thank you again and again, but I am quite well." "Then take your tea at once, I beg," said Flora, "and this wing of fowl and bit of ham, don't mind me or wait for me, because I always carry in this tray myself to Mr. F.'s aunt, who breakfasts in bed, and a charming old lady too, and very clever. Portrait of Mr. F. behind the door, and very like, though too much for it. And as to a pillar with a marble pavement and balustrades, and a mountain, I never saw him near it, nor not likely in the wine trade. Excellent man, but not at all in that way." Little Dorrit glanced at the portrait, very imperfectly following the references to that work of art. "Mr. F. was so devoted to me that he never could bear me out of his sight," said Flora, "though of course I am unable to say how long that might have lasted if he hadn't been cut short while I was a new broom. Worthy man, but not poetical, manly prose, but not romance." Little Dorrit glanced at the portrait again. The artist had given it a head that would have been, in an intellectual point of view, top-heavy for Shakespeare. "Romance, however," Flora went on, busily arranging Mr. F.'s aunt's toast, "as I openly said to Mr. F. when he proposed to me, and you will be surprised to hear that he proposed 7 times, once in a hackney coach, once in a boat, once in a pew, once on a donkey at Tunbridge Wells, and the rest on his knees. Romance was fled with the early days of Arthur Clennam. Our parents tore us asunder, we became marble, and stern reality usurped the throne. Mr. F. said very much to his credit that he was perfectly aware of it, and even preferred that state of things accordingly. The word was spoken at the fire, it went forth, and such is life, you see, my dear, and yet we do not break but bend. Pray make a good breakfast when I go in with the tray." She disappeared, leaving Little Dorrit to ponder over the meaning of her scattered words. She soon came back again, and at last began to take her own breakfast, talking all the while. "You see, my dear," said Flora, measuring out a spoonful or two of some brown liquid that smelt like brandy, and putting it into her tea, "I am obliged to be careful to follow the directions of my medical man, though the flavour is anything but agreeable, being a poor creature, and it may be have never recovered the shock received in youth from too much giving way to crying in the next room, and separated from Arthur. Have you known him long?" As soon as Little Dorrit comprehended that she had been asked this question, for which time was necessary, the galloping pace of her new patroness having left her far behind, she answered that she had known Mr. Clennam ever since his return. "To be sure you couldn't have known him before, unless you had been in China, or had corresponded, neither of which is likely," returned Flora, "for travelling people usually get more or less mahogany, and you are not at all so. And as to corresponding, what about? "That's very true, unless so it was at his mother's, was it really, that you knew him first? Highly sensible and firm, but dreadfully severe, ought to be the mother of the man in the iron mask." "Mrs. Clennam has been kind to me," said little Dorrit. "Really? I am sure I am glad to hear it, because as Arthur's mother it's naturally pleasant to my feelings to have a better opinion of her than I had before, though what she thinks of me when I run on as I am certain to do, and she sits glowering at me like fate in a go-cart, shocking comparison really, invalid, and not her fault, I never know or can imagine." "Shall I find my work anywhere, ma'am?" asked little Dorrit, looking timidly about. "Can I get it?" "You industrious little fairy," returned Flora, taking in another cup of tea, another of the doses prescribed by her medical man. "There's not the slightest hurry, and it's better that we should begin by being confidential about our mutual friend. Too cold a word for me, at least I don't mean that, very proper expression, mutual friend, than become through mere formalities, not you but me, like the Spartan boy with the fox biting him, which I hope you'll excuse my bringing up for all the tiresome boys that will go tumbling into every sort of company that boy's the tiresomest." Little Dorrit, her face very pale, sat down again to listen. "Hadn't I better work the while?" she asked. "I can work and attend too. I would rather, if I may." Her earnestness was so expressive of her being uneasy without her work, that Flora answered, "Well, my dear, whatever you like best," and produced a basket of white handkerchiefs. Little Dorrit gladly put it by her side, took out her little pocket housewife, threaded the needle, and began to hem. "What nimble fingers you have," said Flora. "But are you sure you're well?" "Oh, yes, indeed." Flora put her feet upon the fender, and settled herself for a thorough good romantic disclosure. She started off at score, tossing her head, sighing in the most demonstrative manner, making a great deal of use of her eyebrows, and occasionally, but not often, glancing at the quiet face that bent over the work. "You must know, my dear," said Flora, "but that I have no doubt you know already, not only because I have already thrown it out in a general way, but because I feel I carry it stamped in burning, what's his name, upon my brow, that before I was introduced to the late Mr. F., I had been engaged to Arthur Clennam, Mr. Clennam in public where reserve is necessary, Arthur here. We were all in all to one another, it was the morning of life, it was bliss, it was frenzy, it was everything else of that sort in the highest degree. When rent asunder we turned to stone, in which capacity Arthur went to China, and I became the statue bride of the late Mr. F. Flora, uttering these words in a deep voice, enjoyed herself immensely. "To paint," said she, "the emotions of that morning, when all was marble within, and Mr. F.'s aunt followed in a glass coach, which it stands to reason must have been in shameful repair, or it never could have broken down 2 streets from the house, and Mr. F.'s aunt brought home like the 5th of November in a rush-bottomed chair, I will not attempt. Suffice it to say that the hollow form of breakfast took place in the dining-room downstairs, that papa partaking too freely of pickled salmon was ill for weeks, and that Mr. F. and myself went upon a continental tour to Calais, where the people fought for us on the pier until they separated us, though not forever, that was not yet to be." The statue bride, hardly pausing for breath, went on with the greatest complacency, in a rambling manner sometimes incidental to flesh and blood. "I will draw a veil over that dreamy life. Mr. F. was in good spirits, his appetite was good, he liked the cookery, he considered the wine weak but palatable, and all was well. We returned to the immediate neighbourhood of No. 30 Little Gosling Street, London Docks, and settled down, ere we had yet fully detected the housemaid in selling the feathers out of the spare bed, gout flying upwards soared with Mr. F. to another sphere." His relict, with a glance at his portrait, shook her head and wiped her eyes. "I revere the memory of Mr. F. as an estimable man and most indulgent husband, only necessary to mention asparagus, and it appeared, or to hint at any little delicate thing to drink, and it came like magic in a pint bottle. It was not ecstasy, but it was comfort. I returned to papa's roof, and lived secluded if not happy during some years, until one day papa came smoothly blundering in, and said that Arthur Clennam awaited me below. I went below and found him. Ask me not what I found him, except that he was still unmarried, still unchanged." The dark mystery with which Flora now enshrouded herself might have stopped other fingers than the nimble fingers that worked near her. They worked on without pause, and the busy head bent over them watching the stitches. "Ask me not," said Flora, "if I love him still, or if he still loves me, or what the end is to be, or when. We are surrounded by watchful eyes, and it may be that we are destined to pine asunder. It may be never more to be reunited, not a word, not a breath, not a look to betray us. All must be secret as the tomb. Wonder not, therefore, that even if I should seem comparatively cold to Arthur, or Arthur should seem comparatively cold to me, we have fatal reasons. It is enough, if we understand them. Hush!" All of which Flora said with so much headlong vehemence, as if she really believed it. There is not much doubt that when she worked herself into full mermaid condition, she did actually believe whatever she said in it. "Hush!" repeated Flora. "I have now told you all. Confidence is established between us. Hush! For Arthur's sake, I will always be a friend to you, my dear girl, and in Arthur's name you may always rely upon me." The nimble fingers laid aside the work, and the little figure rose and kissed her hand. "You are very cold," said Flora, changing to her own natural kind-hearted manner, and gaining greatly by the change. "Don't work to-day. I am sure you are not well. I am sure you are not strong. It is only that I feel a little overcome by your kindness, and by Mr. Clennam's kindness in confiding me to one he has known and loved so long." "Well, really, my dear," said Flora, who had a decided tendency to be always honest when she gave herself time to think about it, "it's as well to leave that alone now, for I couldn't undertake to say after all, but it doesn't signify. Lie down a little." "I have always been strong enough to do what I want to do, and I shall be quite well directly," returned little Dorrit with a faint smile. "You have overpowered me with gratitude, that's all. If I keep near the window for a moment, I shall be quite myself." Flora opened a window, sat her in a chair by it, and considerately retired to her former place. It was a windy day, and the air stirring on little Dorrit's face soon brightened it. In a very few minutes she returned to her basket of work, and her nimble fingers were as nimble as ever. Quietly pursuing her task, she asked Flora if Mr. Clennam had told her where she lived. When Flora replied in the negative, little Dorrit said that she understood why he had been so delicate, but that she felt sure he would approve of her confiding her secret to Flora, and that she would therefore do so now with Flora's permission. Receiving an encouraging answer, she condensed the narrative of her life into a few scanty words about herself and a glowing eulogy upon her father. Flora took it all in with a natural tenderness that quite understood it, and in which there was no incoherence. When dinner time came, Flora drew the arm of her new charge through hers, and led her downstairs, and presented her to the patriarch and Mr. Panks, who were already in the dining-room, waiting to begin. Mr. F.'s aunt was, for the time, laid up in ordinary in her chamber. By those gentlemen she was received according to their characters, the patriarch appearing to do her some inestimable service in saying that he was glad to see her, and Mr. Panks blowing off his favourite sound as a salute. In that new presence she would have been bashful enough under any circumstances, and particularly under Flora's insisting on her drinking a glass of wine and eating of the best that was there, but her constraint was greatly increased by Mr. Panks. The demeanour of that gentleman at first suggested to her mind that he might be a taker of likenesses, so intently did he look at her, and so frequently did he glance at the little note-book by his side. Observing that he made no sketch, however, and that he talked about business only, she began to have suspicions that he represented some creditor of her father's, the balance due to whom was noted in that pocket volume. Regarded from this point of view, Mr. Panks's puffings expressed injury and impatience, and each of his louder snorts became a demand for payment. But here again she was undeceived by anomalous and incongruous conduct on the part of Mr. Panks himself. She had left the table half an hour, and was at work alone. Flora had gone to lie down in the next room, concurrently with which retirement, a smell of something to drink had broken out in the house. The patriarch was fast asleep, with his philanthropic mouth open under a yellow pocket-handkerchief in the dining-room. At this quiet time, Mr. Panks softly appeared before her, urbanely nodding. "Find it a little dull, Miss Dorrit?" inquired Panks in a low voice. "No, thank you, sir," said little Dorrit. "Busy, I see," observed Mr. Panks, stealing into the room by inches. "What are those now, Miss Dorrit?" "Handkerchiefs." "Are they, though?" said Panks. "I shouldn't have thought it." Not in the least looking at them, but looking at little Dorrit. "Perhaps you wonder who I am. Shall I tell you? I am a fortune-teller." Little Dorrit now began to think he was mad. "I belong body and soul to my proprietor," said Panks. "You saw my proprietor having his dinner below, but I do a little in the other way sometimes, privately, very privately, Miss Dorrit." Little Dorrit looked at him doubtfully, and not without alarm. "I wish you'd show me the palm of your hand," said Panks. "I should like to have a look at it. Don't let me be troublesome." He was so far troublesome that he was not at all wanted there, but she laid her work in her lap for a moment, and held out her left hand with her thimble on it. "Years of toil, eh?" said Panks, softly touching it with his blunt forefinger. "But what else are we made for? Nothing. Hullo!" looking into the lines. "What's this with bars? It's a college. And what's this with a grey gown and a black velvet cap? It's a father. And what's this with a clarionet? It's an uncle. And what's this in dancing shoes? It's a sister. And what's this straggling about in an idle sort of a way? It's a brother. And what's this thinking for 'em all? Why, this is you, Miss Dorrit." Her eyes met his as she looked up wonderingly into his face, and she thought that although his were sharp eyes, he was a brighter and gentler-looking man than she had supposed at dinner. His eyes were on her hand again directly, and her opportunity of confirming or correcting the impression was gone. "Now the deuce is in it," muttered Panks, tracing out a line in her hand with his clumsy finger. "If this isn't me in the corner here. What do I want here? What's behind me?" He carried his finger slowly down to the wrist, and round the wrist, and affected to look at the back of the hand for what was behind him. "Is it any harm?" asked little Dorrit, smiling. "Deuce a bit," said Panks. "What do you think it's worth?" "I ought to ask you that. I am not the fortune-teller." "True," said Panks. "What's it worth? You shall live to see, Miss Dorrit." Releasing the hand by slow degrees, he drew all his fingers through his prongs of hair, so that they stood up in their most portentous manner, and repeated slowly, "Remember what I say, Miss Dorrit. You shall live to see." She could not help showing that she was much surprised, if it were only by his knowing so much about her. "Ah, that's it," said Panks, pointing at her. "Miss Dorrit, not that ever." More surprised than before, and a little more frightened, she looked to him for an explanation of his last words. "Not that," said Panks, making with great seriousness an imitation of a surprised look and manner that appeared to be unintentionally grotesque. "Don't do that. Never on seeing me, no matter when, no matter where. I am nobody. Don't take on to mind me. Don't mention me. Take no notice. Will you agree, Miss Dorrit?" "I hardly know what to say," returned little Dorrit, quite astounded. "Why?" "Because I'm a fortune-teller, Panks the gipsy. I haven't told you so much of your fortune yet, Miss Dorrit, as to tell you what's behind me on that little hand. I have told you you shall live to see. Is it agreed, Miss Dorrit?" "Agreed? That I am to—" "To take no notice of me away from here, unless I take on first. Not to mind me when I come and go. It's very easy. I am no loss. I am not handsome. I am not good company. I am only my proprietor's grubber. You need do no more than think. Ah, Panks the gipsy at his fortune-telling. You'll tell the rest of my fortune one day. I shall live to know it. Is it agreed, Miss Dorrit?" "Yes," faltered little Dorrit, whom he greatly confused. "I suppose so, while you do no harm." "Good." Mr. Panks glanced at the wall of the adjoining room, and stooped forward. "Honest creature, woman of capital points, but heedless and a loose talker, Miss Dorrit." With that he rubbed his hands as if the interview had been very satisfactory to him, panted away to the door, and urbanely nodded himself out again. If little Dorrit were beyond measure perplexed by this curious conduct on the part of her new acquaintance, and by finding herself involved in this singular treaty, her perplexity was not diminished by ensuing circumstances. Besides that Mr. Panks took every opportunity afforded him in Mr. Casby's house of significantly glancing at her and snorting at her, which was not much. After what he had done already, he began to pervade her daily life. She saw him in the street constantly. When she went to Mr. Casby's, he was always there. When she went to Mrs. Clennam's, he came there on any pretence, as if to keep her in his sight. A week had not gone by when she found him, to her astonishment, in the lodge one night, conversing with a turnkey on duty, and to all appearance one of his familiar companions. Her next surprise was to find him equally at his ease within the prison, to hear of his presenting himself among the visitors at her father's Sunday levee, to see him arm in arm with a collegiate friend about the yard, to learn from fame that he had greatly distinguished himself one evening at the social club that held its meetings in the snuggery, by addressing a speech to the members of the institution, singing a song, and treating the company to 5 gallons of ale. Report madly added a bushel of shrimps. The effect on Mr. Plornish of such of these phenomena as he became an eyewitness of in his faithful visits, made an impression on little Dorrit only second to that produced by the phenomena themselves. They seemed to gag and bind him. He could only stare, and sometimes weakly mutter that it wouldn't be believed down Bleeding Heart Yard that this was Panks, but he never said a word more, or made a sign more, even to little Dorrit. Mr. Panks crowned his mysteries by making himself acquainted with Tip in some unknown manner, and taking a Sunday saunter into the college on that gentleman's arm. Throughout he never took any notice of little Dorrit, save once or twice when he happened to come close to her, and there was no one very near, on which occasions he said in passing, with a friendly look and a puff of encouragement, "Panks the gipsy, fortune-telling." Little Dorrit worked and strove as usual, wondering at all this, but keeping her wonder, as she had from her earliest years kept many heavier loads in her own breast. A change had stolen, and was stealing yet, over the patient heart. Every day found her something more retiring than the day before. To pass in and out of the prison unnoticed, and elsewhere to be overlooked and forgotten, were for herself her chief desires. To her own room, too, strangely assorted room for her delicate youth and character, she was glad to retreat as often as she could without desertion of any duty. There were afternoon times when she was unemployed, when visitors dropped in to play a hand at cards with her father, when she could be spared and was better away. Then she would flit along the yard, climb the scores of stairs that led to her room, and take her seat at the window. Many combinations did those spikes upon the wall assume, many light shapes did the strong iron weave itself into, many golden touches fell upon the rust, while little Dorrit sat there musing. New zigzags sprung into the cruel pattern sometimes, when she saw it through a burst of tears. But beautified or hardened still, always over it and under it and through it, she was fain to look in her solitude, seeing everything with that ineffaceable brand. A garret, and a Marshalsea garret without compromise, was little Dorrit's room. Beautifully kept, it was ugly in itself, and had little but cleanliness and air to set it off, for what embellishment she had ever been able to buy had gone to her father's room. Howbeit, for this poor place she showed an increasing love, and to sit in it alone became her favourite rest. Insomuch that on a certain afternoon during the Panks mysteries, when she was seated at her window, and heard Maggie's well-known step coming up the stairs, she was very much disturbed by the apprehension of being summoned away. As Maggie's step came higher up and nearer, she trembled and faltered, and it was as much as she could do to speak when Maggie at length appeared. "Please, little mother," said Maggie, panting for breath, "you must come down and see him. He's here." "Who, Maggie?" "Who? Of course, Mr. Clennam. He's in your father's room, and he says to me, 'Maggie, will you be so kind and go and say it's only me?'" "I am not very well, Maggie. I had better not go. I'm going to lie down. See, I lie down now to ease my head. Say with my grateful regard that you left me so, or I would have come." "Well, it aren't very polite though, little mother," said the staring Maggie, "to turn your face away, neither." Maggie was very susceptible to personal slights, and very ingenious in inventing them. "Putting both your hands afore your face, too," she went on. "If you can't bear the looks of a poor thing, it would be better to tell her so at once, and not go and shut her out like that, hurting her feelings and breaking her heart at 10 years old, poor thing." "It's to ease my head, Maggie." "Well, and if you cry to ease your head, little mother, let me cry too. Don't go and have all the crying to yourself," expostulated Maggie. "But I'm not being greedy," and immediately began to blubber. It was with some difficulty that she could be induced to go back with the excuse, but the promise of being told a story, of all her great delight, on condition that she concentrated her faculties upon the errand, and left her little mistress to herself for an hour longer, combined with a misgiving on Maggie's part that she had left her good temper at the bottom of the staircase, prevailed. So away she went, muttering her message all the way to keep it in her mind, and, at the appointed time, came back. "He was very sorry, I can tell you," she announced, "and wanted to send a doctor, and he's coming again to-morrow, he is, and I don't think he'll have a good sleep to-night along o' hearing about your head, little mother. Oh my, ain't you been a-crying?" "I think I have, a little, Maggie." "A little? Oh!" "But it's all over now, all over for good, Maggie, and my head is much better and cooler, and I am quite comfortable. I am very glad I did not go down." Her great staring child tenderly embraced her, and having smoothed her hair, and bathed her forehead and eyes with cold water, offices in which her awkward hands became skilful, hugged her again, exulted in her brighter looks, and stationed her in her chair by the window. Over against this chair, Maggie, with apoplectic exertions that were not at all required, dragged the box which was her seat on story-telling occasions, sat down upon it, hugged her own knees, and said, with a voracious appetite for stories, and with widely opened eyes, "Now, little mother, let's have a good un." "What shall it be about, Maggie?" "Oh, let's have a princess," said Maggie, "and let her be a regular one, beyond all belief, you know." Little Dorrit considered for a moment, and with a rather sad smile upon her face, which was flushed by the sunset, began. "Maggie, there was once upon a time a fine king, and he had everything he could wish for, and a great deal more. He had gold and silver, diamonds and rubies, riches of every kind. He had palaces, and he had—" "Hospitals," interposed Maggie, still nursing her knees. "Let him have hospitals, because they're so comfortable. Hospitals with lots of chicking." "Yes, he had plenty of them, and he had plenty of everything." "Plenty of baked potatoes, for instance?" said Maggie. "Plenty of everything." "Lord!" chuckled Maggie, giving her knees a hug. "Wasn't it prime?" "This king had a daughter, who was the wisest and most beautiful princess that ever was seen. When she was a child, she understood all her lessons before her masters taught them to her, and when she was grown up, she was the wonder of the world. Now, near the palace where this princess lived, there was a cottage in which there was a poor little tiny woman who lived all alone by herself." "An old woman?" said Maggie with an unctuous smack of her lips. "No, not an old woman. quite a young one." "I wonder she weren't afraid," said Maggie. "Go on, please." "The princess passed the cottage nearly every day, and whenever she went in by her beautiful carriage, she saw the poor tiny woman spinning at her wheel, and she looked at the tiny woman, and the tiny woman looked at her. So, one day she stopped the coachman a little way from the cottage, and got out and walked on, and peeped in at the door, and there, as usual, was the tiny woman spinning at her wheel, and she looked at the princess, and the princess looked at her." "Like trying to stare one another out," said Maggie. "Please go on, little mother." The princess was such a wonderful princess that she had the power of knowing secrets, and she said to the tiny woman, "Why do you keep it there?" This showed her directly that the princess knew why she lived all alone by herself spinning at her wheel, and she kneeled down at the princess' feet and asked her never to betray her. So the princess said, "I never will betray you. Let me see it." So the tiny woman closed the shutter of the cottage window and fastened the door, and trembling from head to foot for fear that any one should suspect her, opened a very secret place and showed the princess a shadow. "Lor!" said Maggie. It was the shadow of someone who had gone by long before, of someone who had gone on far away quite out of reach, never, never to come back. It was bright to look at, and when the tiny woman showed it to the princess, she was proud of it with all her heart, as a great, great treasure. When the princess had considered it a little while, she said to the tiny woman, "And you keep watch over this every day?" And she cast down her eyes and whispered, "Yes." Then the princess said, "Remind me why." To which the other replied that no one so good and kind had ever passed that way, and that was why in the beginning. She said too that nobody missed it, that nobody was the worse for it, that someone had gone on to those who were expecting him. "Someone was a man, then?" interposed Maggie. Little Dorrit timidly said yes, she believed so, and resumed. "Had gone on to those who were expecting him, and that this remembrance was stolen or kept back from nobody." The princess made answer, "Ah, but when the cottager died it would be discovered there." The tiny woman told her no. When that time came, it would sink quietly into her own grave, and would never be found. "Well, to be sure," said Maggie. "Go on, please." The princess was very much astonished to hear this, as you may suppose, Maggie. "And well she might be," said Maggie. So she resolved to watch the tiny woman and see what came of it. Every day she drove in her beautiful carriage by the cottage door, and there she saw the tiny woman always alone by herself spinning at her wheel, and she looked at the tiny woman, and the tiny woman looked at her. At last one day the wheel was still, and the tiny woman was not to be seen. When the princess made inquiries why the wheel had stopped, and where the tiny woman was, she was informed that the wheel had stopped because there was nobody to turn it, the tiny woman being dead. "They ought to have took her to the hospital," said Maggie, "and then she'd have got over it." The princess, after crying a very little for the loss of the tiny woman, dried her eyes and got out of her carriage at the place where she had stopped it before, and went to the cottage and peeped in at the door. There was nobody to look at her now, and nobody for her to look at, so she went in at once to search for the treasured shadow. But there was no sign of it to be found anywhere, and then she knew that the tiny woman had told her the truth, and that it would never give anybody any trouble, and that it had sunk quietly into her own grave, and that she and it were at rest together. That's all, Maggie. The sunset flash was so bright on little Dorrit's face when she came thus to the end of her story, that she interposed her hand to shade it. "Had she got to be old?" Maggie asked. "The tiny woman? Ah, I don't know," said little Dorrit. "But it would have been just the same if she had been ever so old." "Would it really?" said Maggie. "Well, I suppose it would, though. and sat staring and ruminating. She sat so long with her eyes wide open, that at length little Dorrit, to entice her from her box, rose and looked out of window. As she glanced down into the yard, she saw Panks come in and leer up with the corner of his eye as he went by. "Who's he, little mother?" said Maggie. She had joined her at the window, and was leaning on her shoulder. "I see him come in and out often." "I have heard him called a fortune-teller," said little Dorrit, "but I doubt if he could tell many people even their past or present fortunes." "Couldn't have told the princess hers," said Maggie. Little Dorrit, looking musingly down into the dark valley of the prison, shook her head. "Nor the tiny woman hers?" said Maggie. "No," said little Dorrit, with the sunset very bright upon her. "But let us come away from the window." End of chapter the 24th, book the 1st. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter the 25th, book the 1st, of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Alice Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens, book the 1st, chapter the 25th. Conspirators and Others. The private residence of Mr. Panks was in Pentonville, where he lodged on the second floor of a professional gentleman in an extremely small way, who had an inner door within the street door, poised on a spring and starting open with a click like a trap, and who wrote up in the fanlight, "Rugg, General Agent, Accountant, gets recovered." This scroll, majestic in its severe simplicity, illuminated a little slip of front garden abutting on the thirsty high road, where a few of the dustiest of leaves hung their dismal heads and led a life of choking. A professor of writing occupied the first floor, and enlivened the garden railings with glass cases containing choice examples of what his pupils had been before 6 lessons, and while the whole of his young family shook the table, and what they had become after 6 lessons when the young family was under restraint. The tenancy of Mr. Panks was limited to one airy bedroom, he covenanting and agreeing with Mr. Rugg his landlord, that in consideration of a certain scale of payments accurately defined, and on certain verbal notice duly given, he should be at liberty to elect to share the Sunday breakfast, dinner, tea, or supper, or each or any or all of those repasts or meals of Mr. and Miss Rugg, his daughter, in the back parlour. Miss Rugg was a lady of a little property which she had acquired, together with much distinction in the neighbourhood, by having her heart severely lacerated and her feelings mangled by a middle-aged baker resident in the vicinity, against whom she had, by the agency of Mr. Rugg, found it necessary to proceed at law to recover damages for a breach of promise of marriage. The baker having been, by the counsel for Miss Rugg, witheringly denounced on that occasion up to the full amount of 20 guineas, at the rate of about 18 pence an epithet, and having been cast in corresponding damages, still suffered occasional persecution from the youth of Pentonville. But Miss Rugg, environed by the majesty of the law, and having her damages invested in the public securities, was regarded with consideration. In the society of Mr. Rigg, who had a round white visage, as if all his blushes had been drawn out of him long ago, and who had a ragged yellow head like a worn-out hearth-broom, and in the society of Miss Rugg, who had little nankeen spots, like shirt-buttons, all over her face, and whose own yellow tresses were rather scrubby than luxuriant, Mr. Panks had usually dined on Sundays for some few years, and had twice a week or so enjoyed an evening collation of bread, Dutch cheese, and porter. Mr. Panks was one of the very few marriageable men for whom Miss Rugg had no terrors, the argument with which he reassured himself being twofold. That is to say, firstly, that it wouldn't do twice, and secondly, that he wasn't worth it. Fortified within this double armour, Mr. Panks snorted at Miss Rugg on easy terms. Up to this time, Mr. Panks had transacted little or no business at his quarters in Pentonville, except in the sleeping line. But now that he had become a fortune-teller, he was often closeted after midnight with Mr. Rugg in his little front parlour office, and even after those untimely hours burned tallow in his bedroom. Though his duties as his proprietor's grubber were in no wise lessened, and though that service bore no greater resemblance to a bed of roses than was to be discovered in its many thorns, some new branch of industry made a constant demand upon him. When he cast off the patriarch at night, it was only to take an anonymous craft in tow, and labour away afresh in other waters. The advance from a personal acquaintance with the elder Mr. Chivery to an introduction to his amiable wife and disconsolate son may have been easy, but easy or not, Mr. Panks soon made it. He nestled in the bosom of the tobacco business within a week or two after his first appearance in the college, and particularly addressed himself to the cultivation of a good understanding with young John. In this endeavour he so prospered as to lure that pining shepherd forth from the groves, and tempt him to undertake mysterious missions, on which he began to disappear at uncertain intervals for as long a space as 2 or 3 days together. The prudent Mrs. Chivery, who wondered greatly at this change, would have protested against it as detrimental to the Highland typification on the door-post, but for 2 forcible reasons. One, that her John was roused to take strong interest in the business which the estates were supposed to advance, and this she held to be good for his drooping spirits. The other, that Mr. Panks confidentially agreed to pay her, for the occupation of her son's time, at the handsome rate of 7 and 6pence per day. The proposal originated with himself, and was couched in the pithy terms, "If your John is weak enough, ma'am, not to take it, that is no reason why you should be, don't you see? So, quite between ourselves, ma'am, business being business, here it is." What Mr. Chivery thought of these things, or how much or how little he knew about them, was never gathered from himself. It has been already remarked that he was a man of few words, and it may be here observed that he had imbibed a professional habit of locking everything up. He locked himself up as carefully as he locked up the Marshalsea debtors. Even his custom of bolting his meals may have been a part of an uniform whole. But there is no question that, as to all other purposes, he kept his mouth as he kept the Marshalsea door. He never opened it without occasion. When it was necessary to let anything out, he opened it a little way, held it open just as long as sufficed for the purpose, and locked it again. Even as he would be sparing of his trouble at the Marshalsea door, and would keep a visitor who wanted to go out, waiting for a few moments if he saw another visitor coming down the yard, so that one turn of the key should suffice for both. Similarly, he would often reserve a remark if he perceived another on its way to his lips, and would deliver himself of the 2 together. As to any key to his inner knowledge being to be found in his face, the Marshalsea key was as legible as an index to the individual characters and histories upon which it was turned. That Mr. Panks should be moved to invite any one to dinner at Pentonville was an unprecedented fact in his calendar. But he invited young John to dinner, and even brought him within range of the dangerous, because expensive, fascinations of Miss Rugg. The banquet was appointed for a Sunday, and Miss Rugg with her own hands stuffed a leg of mutton with oysters on the occasion, and sent it to the baker's, not the baker's, but an opposition establishment. Provision of oranges, apples, and nuts was also made, and rum was brought home by Mr. Panks on Saturday night, to gladden the visitor's heart. The store of creature comforts was not the chief part of the visitor's reception. Its special feature was a foregone family confidence and sympathy. When young John appeared at 1:30 without the ivory hand and waistcoat of golden sprigs, the sun shorn of his beams by disastrous clouds, Mr. Panks presented him to the yellow-haired Ruggs as the young man he had so often mentioned who loved Miss Dorrit. "I am glad," said Mr. Rugg, challenging him specially in that character, "to have the distinguished gratification of making your acquaintance, sir. Your feelings do you honour. You are young. May you never outlive your feelings. If I was to outlive my own feelings, sir, said Mr. Rugg, who was a man of many words, and was considered to possess a remarkably good address, if I was to outlive my own feelings, I'd leave £50 in my will to the man who would put me out of existence. Miss Rugg heaved a sigh. My daughter, sir, said Mr. Rugg. Anastasia, you are no stranger to the state of this young man's affections. My daughter has had her trials, sir. Mr. Rugg might have used the word more pointedly in the singular number. And she can feel for you. Young John, almost overwhelmed by the touching nature of this greeting, professed himself to that effect. What I envy you, sir, is, said Mr. Rugg, allow me to take your hat. We are rather short of pegs. I'll put it in the corner. Nobody will tread on it there. What I envy you, sir, is the luxury of your own feelings. I belong to a profession in which that luxury is sometimes denied us. Young John replied with acknowledgments that he only hoped he did what was right, and what showed how entirely he was devoted to Miss Dorrit. He wished to be unselfish, and he hoped he was. He wished to do anything as laid in his power to serve Miss Dorrit, altogether putting himself out of sight, and he hoped he did. It was but little that he could do, but he hoped he did it. Sir, said Mr. Rugg, taking him by the hand, you are a young man that it does one good to come across. You are a young man that I should like to put in the witness box to humanize the minds of the legal profession. I hope you have brought your appetite with you, and intend to play a good knife and fork. Thank you, sir, returned young John. I don't eat much at present. Mr. Rugg drew him a little apart. My daughter's case, sir, said he, at the time when, in vindication of her outraged feelings and her sex, she became the plaintiff in Rugg and Bawkins. I suppose I could have put it in evidence, Mr. Chivery, if I had thought it worth my while, that the amount of solid sustenance my daughter consumed at that period did not exceed 10 ounces per week. I think I go a little beyond that, sir, returned the other, hesitating, as if he confessed it with some shame. But in your case there is no fiend in human form, said Mr. Rugg with argumentative smile and action of hand. Observe, Mr. Chivery. No fiend in human form. No, sir, certainly. Young John added with simplicity, I should be very sorry if there was. The sentiment, said Mr. Rugg, is what I should have expected from your known principles. It would affect my daughter greatly, sir, if she heard it. As I perceive the mutton, I am glad she didn't hear it. Mr. Panks, on this occasion, pray face me. My dear, face Mr. Chivery. For what we are going to receive, may we and Miss Dorrit be truly thankful. But for a grave waggishness in Mr. Rugg's manner of delivering this introduction to the feast, it might have appeared that Miss Dorrit was expected to be one of the company. Panks recognized the sally in his usual way, and took in his provender in his usual way. Miss Rugg, perhaps making up some of her arrears, likewise took very kindly to the mutton, and it rapidly diminished to the bone. A bread and butter pudding entirely disappeared, and a considerable amount of cheese and radishes vanished by the same means. Then came the dessert. Then also, and before the broaching of the rum and water, came Mr. Panks's notebook. The ensuing business proceedings were brief but curious, and rather in the nature of a conspiracy. Mr. Panks looked over his notebook, which was now getting full, studiously, and picked out little extracts, which he wrote on separate slips of paper on the table. Mr. Rugg, in the meanwhile, looking at him with close attention, and young John losing his uncollected eye in mists of meditation. When Mr. Panks, who supported the character of chief conspirator, had completed his extracts, he looked them over, corrected them, put up his notebook, and held them like a hand at cards. Now, there's a churchyard in Bedfordshire, said Panks. Who takes it? I'll take it, sir, returned Mr. Rugg, if no one bids. Mr. Panks dealt him his card, and looked at his hand again. "Now there's an inquiry in York," said Panks. "Who takes it?" "I'm not good for York," said Mr. Rugg. "Then perhaps," pursued Panks, "you'll be so obliging, John Chivery?" Young John assenting, Panks dealt him his card, and consulted his hand again. "There's a church in London. I may as well take that, and a family Bible. I may as well take that too. That's 2 to me. 2 to me," repeated Panks, breathing hard over his cards. "Here's a clerk at Durham for you, John, and an old seafaring gentleman at Dunstable for you, Mr. Rugg. 2 to me, was it? Yes, 2 to me. Here's a stone. 3 to me. And a still-born baby. 4 to me. And all for the present, told." When he had thus disposed of his cards, all being done very quietly and in a suppressed tone, Mr. Panks puffed his way into his own breast-pocket and tugged out a canvas bag, from which, with a sparing hand, he told forth money for travelling expenses in 2 little portions. "Cash goes out fast," he said anxiously, as he pushed a portion to each of his male companions. "Very fast." "I can only assure you, Mr. Panks," said young John, "that I deeply regret my circumstances being such that I can't afford to pay my own charges, or that it's not advisable to allow me the time necessary for my doing the distances on foot, because nothing would give me greater satisfaction than to walk myself off my legs without fee or reward." This young man's disinterestedness appeared so very ludicrous in the eyes of Miss Rugg, that she was obliged to effect a precipitate retirement from the company, and to sit upon the stairs until she had had her laugh out. Meanwhile Mr. Panks, looking not without some pity at young John, slowly and thoughtfully twisted up his canvas bag as if he were wringing its neck. The lady, returning as he restored it to his pocket, mixed rum and water for the party, not forgetting her fair self, and handed to every one his glass. When all was supplied, Mr. Rugg rose, and silently holding out his glass at arm's length above the centre of the table, by that gesture invited the other 3 to add theirs, and to unite in a general conspiratorial clink. The ceremony was effective up to a certain point, and would have been wholly so throughout, if Miss Rugg, as she raised her glass to her lips in completion of it, had not happened to look at young John, when she was again so overcome by the contemptible comicality of his disinterestedness as to splatter some ambrosial drops of rum and water around, and withdraw in confusion. Such was the dinner without precedent, given by Panks at Pentonville, and such was the busy and strange life Panks led. The only waking moments at which he appeared to relax from his cares, and to recreate himself by going anywhere or saying anything without a pervading object, were when he showed a dawning interest in the lame foreigner with a stick, down Bleeding Heart Yard. The foreigner, by name John Baptist Cavaletto, they called him Mr. Baptist in the yard, was such a chirping, easy, hopeful little fellow, that his attraction for Panks was probably in the force of contrast. Solitary, weak, and scantily acquainted with the most necessary words of the only language in which he could communicate with the people about him, he went with the stream of his fortunes in a brisk way that was new in those parts, with little to eat, and less to drink, and nothing to wear but what he wore upon him, or had brought tied up in one of the smallest bundles that ever were seen. He put as bright a face upon it as if he were in the most flourishing circumstances, when he first hobbled up and down the yard, humbly propitiating the general goodwill with his white teeth. It was uphill work for a foreigner, lame or sound, to make his way with the Bleeding Hearts. In the first place, they were vaguely persuaded that every foreigner had a knife about him. In the second, they held it to be a sound constitutional national axiom that he ought to go home to his own country. They never thought of inquiring how many of their own countrymen would be returned upon their hands from divers parts of the world, if the principle were generally recognized. They considered it particularly and peculiarly British. In the third place, they had a notion that it was a sort of divine visitation upon a foreigner, that he was not an Englishman, and that all kinds of calamities happened to his country, because it did things that England did not, and did not do things that England did. In this belief, to be sure, they had long been carefully trained by the Barnacles and Stiltstalkings, who were always proclaiming to them officially that no country which failed to submit itself to those two large families could possibly hope to be under the protection of Providence, and who, when they believed it, disparaged them in private as the most prejudiced people under the sun. This, therefore, might be called a political position of the Bleeding Hearts, but they entertained other objections to having foreigners in the yard. They believed that foreigners were always badly off, and though they were as ill off themselves as they could desire to be, that did not diminish the force of the objection. They believed that foreigners were dragooned and bayoneted, and though they certainly got their own skulls promptly fractured if they showed any ill humour, still it was with a blunt instrument, and that didn't count. They believed that foreigners were always immoral, and though they had an occasional assize at home, and now and then a divorce case or so, that had nothing to do with it. They believed that foreigners had no independent spirit, as never being escorted to the Pole in droves by Lord Decimus Tite Barnacle, with colours flying in the tune of Rule Britannia playing. Not to be tedious, they had many other beliefs of a similar kind. Against these obstacles, the lame foreigner with a stick had to make head as well as he could. Not absolutely single-handed, because Mr. Arthur Clennam had recommended him to the Plornishes. He lived at the top of the same house, but still at heavy odds. However, the Bleeding Hearts were kind hearts, and when they saw the little fellow cheerily limping about with a good-humoured face, doing no harm, drawing no knives, committing no outrageous immoralities, living chiefly on farinaceous and milk diet, and playing with Mrs. Plornish's children of an evening, they began to think that although he could never hope to be an Englishman, still it would be hard to visit that affliction on his head. They began to accommodate themselves to his level, calling him Mr. Baptist, but treating him like a baby, and laughing immoderately at his lively gestures and his childish English, more because he didn't mind it, and laughed too. They spoke to him in very loud voices as if he were stone deaf. They constructed sentences by way of teaching him the language in its purity, such as were addressed by the savages to Captain Cook, or by Friday to Robinson Crusoe. Mrs. Plornish was particularly ingenious in this art, and attained so much celebrity for saying, "Me hope you leg well soon," that it was considered in the yard but a very short remove indeed from speaking Italian. Even Mrs. Plornish herself began to think that she had a natural call towards that language. As he became more popular, household objects were brought into requisition for his instruction in a copious vocabulary, and whenever he appeared in the yard, ladies would fly out at their doors crying, "Mr. Baptist, teapot! Mr. Baptist, dustpan! Mr. Baptist, flour dredger! Mr. Baptist, coffee begin!" at the same time exhibiting those articles and penetrating him with a sense of the appalling difficulties of the Anglo-Saxon tongue. It was in this stage of his progress, and in about the third week of his occupation, that Mr. Panks's fancy became attracted by the little man. Mounting to his attic, attended by Mrs. Plornish as interpreter, he found Mr. Baptist with no furniture, but his bed on the ground, a table and a chair, carving with the aid of a few simple tools, in the blithest way possible. "Now, old chap," said Mr. Panks, "pay up." He had his money ready, folded in a scrap of paper, and laughingly handed it in. Then, with a free action, threw out as many fingers of his right hand as there were shillings, and made a cut crosswise in the air for an odd sixpence. "Oh," said Mr. Panks, watching him wonderingly. "That's it, is it? You're a quick customer. It's all right. I didn't expect to receive it, though." Mrs. Plornish here interposed with great condescension, and explained to Mr. Baptist, please, glad get money." The little man smiled and nodded. His bright face seemed uncommonly attractive to Mr. Panks. "How's he getting on in his limb?" he asked Mrs. Plornish. "Oh, he's a deal better, sir," said Mrs. Plornish. "We expect next week he'll be able to leave off his stick entirely. The opportunity being too favourable to be lost, Mrs. Plornish displayed her great accomplishment by explaining with pardonable pride to Mr. Baptist, "I hope you leg well soon." "He's a merry fellow, too," said Mr. Panks, admiring him as if he were a mechanical toy. "How does he live?" "Why, sir," rejoined Mrs. Plornish, "he turns out to have quite a power of carving them flowers that you see him at now." Mr. Baptist, watching their faces as they spoke, held up his work. Mrs. Plornish interpreted in her Italian manner, on behalf of Mr. Panks, please, double good." "Can he live by that?" asked Mr. Panks. "He can live on very little, sir, and it is expected he will be able, in time, to make a very good living. Mr. Clennam got it him to do, and gives him odd jobs besides in the works next door, makes 'em for him, in short, when he knows he wants 'em." "And what does he do with himself now, when he ain't hard at it?" said Mr. Panks. "Why, not much as yet, sir, on accounts, I suppose, of not being able to walk much, but he goes about the yard, and he chats without particular understanding or being understood, and he plays with the children, and he sits in the sun. He'll sit down anywhere, as if it was an armchair, and he'll sing, and he'll laugh." "Laugh," echoed Mr. Panks. "He looks to me as if every tooth in his head was always laughing." "But whenever he gets to the top of the steps at the other end of the yard," said Mrs. Plornish, "he'll peep out in the curiousest way, so that some of us thinks he's peeping out towards where his own country is, and some of us thinks he's looking for somebody he don't want to see, and some of us don't know what to think." Mr. Baptist seemed to have a general understanding of what she said, or perhaps his quickness caught and applied her slight action of peeping. In any case, he closed his eyes and tossed his head with the air of a man who had sufficient reasons for what he did, and said in his own tongue, it didn't matter, "Altro." "What's altro?" said Panks. It's a sort of a general kind of expression, sir," said Mrs. Plornish. "Is it?" said Panks. "Why, then altro to you, old chap. Good afternoon. Altro." Mr. Baptist, in his vivacious way repeating the word several times, Mr. Panks in his duller way gave it him back once. From that time it became a frequent custom with Panks the gipsy, as he went home jaded at night, to pass round by Bleeding Heart Yard, go quietly up the stairs, look in at Mr. Baptist's door, and, finding him in his room, to say, "Hullo, old chap, altro," to which Mr. Baptist would reply with innumerable bright nods and smiles, "Altro, signore, altro, altro, altro." After this highly condensed conversation, Mr. Panks would go his way with an appearance of being lightened and refreshed. End of chapter the 25th. Book the 1st. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter the 26th. Book the 1st of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Ellis Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Book the 1st. Chapter the 26th. Nobody's State of Mind. If Arthur Clennam had not arrived at that wise decision firmly to restrain himself from loving Pet, he would have lived on a state of much perplexity, involving difficult struggles with his own heart. Not the least of these would have been a contention, always waging within it, between a tendency to dislike Mr. Henry Gowan, if not to regard him with positive repugnance, and a whisper that the inclination was unworthy. A generous nature is not prone to strong aversions, and is slow to admit them even dispassionately, but when it finds ill will gaining upon it, it can discern between whiles that its origin is not dispassionate. Such a nature becomes distressed. Therefore Mr. Henry Gowan would have clouded Clennam's mind, and would have been far oftener present to it than more agreeable persons and subjects but for the general prudence of his decision aforesaid. As it was, Mr. Gowan seemed transferred to Daniel Doyce's mind. At all events, it so happened that it usually fell to Mr. Doyce's turn, rather than to Clennam's, to speak of him in the friendly conversations they held together. These were of frequent occurrence now, As the two partners shared a portion of a roomy house in one of the grave old-fashioned city streets, lying not far from the Bank of England by London Wall. Mr. Dorrit had been to Twickenham to pass the day. Clennam had excused himself. Mr. Dorrit was just come home. He put in his head at the door of Clennam's sitting-room to say good night. Come in, said Clennam. I saw you were reading, returned Dorrit as he entered, and thought you might not care to be disturbed. But for the notable resolution he had made, Clennam really might not have known what he had been reading, really might not have had his eyes upon the book for an hour past, though it lay open before him. He shut it up rather quickly. Are they well? He asked. Yes, said Dorrit. They are well. They are all well. Daniel had an old workman-like habit of carrying his pocket-handkerchief in his hat. He took it out and wiped his forehead with it, slowly repeating, They are all well. Miss Minnie looking particularly well, I thought. Any company at the cottage? No, no company. And how did you get on, you four? Asked Clennam gaily. There were 5 of us, returned his partner. There was, what's his name? He was there. Who is he? Said Clennam. Mr. Henry Gowan. Ah, to be sure, cried Clennam with unusual vivacity. Yes, I forgot him. As I mentioned, you may remember, said Daniel Dorrit, he is always there on Sunday. Yes, returned Clennam, I remember now. Daniel Dorrit, still wiping his forehead, ploddingly repeated, Yes, he was there. Oh yes, he was there. And his dog, he was there too. Miss Meagles is quite attached to the dog, observed Clennam. Quite so, assented his partner. More attached to the dog than I am to the man. You mean Mr. I mean Mr. Gowan most decidedly, said Daniel Dorrit. There was a gap in the conversation, which Clennam devoted to winding up his watch. Perhaps you're a little hasty in your judgment, he said. Our judgments, I am supposing a general case, of course, said Dorrit, are so liable to be influenced by many considerations which, almost without our knowing it, are unfair, that it is necessary to keep a guard upon them. For instance, Mr. Gowan, quietly said Dorrit, upon whom the utterance of the name almost always devolved, is young and handsome, easy and quick, has talent, and has seen a good deal of various kinds of life. It might be difficult to give an unselfish reason for being prepossessed against him. Not difficult for me, I think, Clennam, returned his partner. I see him bringing present anxiety, and, I fear, future sorrow into my old friend's house. I see him wearing deeper lines into my old friend's face. The nearer he draws to, and the oftener he looks at, the face of his daughter. In short, I see him with a net about the pretty and affectionate creature whom he will never make happy. We don't know, said Clennam, almost in the tone of a man in pain, that he will not make her happy. We don't know, returned his partner, that the earth will last another 100 years, but we think it highly probable. Well, said Clennam, we must be hopeful, and we must at least try to be, if not generous, which, in this case, we have no opportunity of being, just. We will not disparage this gentleman, because he is successful in his address to the beautiful object of his ambition, and we will not question her natural right to bestow her love on one whom she finds worthy of it. Maybe, my friend, said Dorrit, maybe also that she is too young and petted, too confiding and inexperienced to discriminate well. That, said Clennam, would be far beyond our power of correction. Daniel Dorrit shook his head gravely and rejoined, I fear so. Therefore, in a word, said Clennam, we should make up our minds that it is not worthy of us to say any ill of Mr. Gowan. It would be a poor thing to gratify a prejudice against him, and I resolve, for my part, not to depreciate him. I am not quite so sure of myself, and therefore I reserve my privilege of objecting to him, returned the other. But if I am not sure of myself, I am sure of you, Clennam, and I know what an upright man you are, and how much to be respected. Good night, my friend and partner. He shook his hand in saying this, as if there had been something serious at the bottom of their conversation, and they separated. By this time they had visited the family on several occasions, and had always observed that even a passing allusion to Mr. Henry Gowan when he was not among them brought back the cloud which had obscured Mr. Meagles's sunshine on the morning of the chance encounter at the ferry. If Clennam had ever admitted the forbidden passion into his breast, this period might have been a period of real trial. Under the actual circumstances, doubtless it was nothing. Nothing. Equally, if his heart had given entertainment to that prohibited guest, his silent fighting of his way through the mental condition of this period might have been a little meritorious. In the constant effort not to be betrayed into a new phase of the besetting sin of his experience, the pursuit of selfish objects by low and small means, and to hold instead to some high principle of honour and generosity, there might have been a little merit. In the resolution not even to avoid Mr. Meagles's house, lest, in the selfish sparing of himself, he should bring any slight distress upon the daughter through making her the cause of an estrangement which he believed the father would regret, there might have been a little merit. In the modest truthfulness of always keeping in view the greater equality of Mr. Gowan's years, and the greater attractions of his person and manner, there might have been a little merit. In doing all this, and much more, in a perfectly unaffected way and with a manful and composed constancy, while the pain within him, peculiar as his life and history, was very sharp, there might have been some quiet strength of character. But after the resolution he had made, of course he could have no such merits as these, and such a state of mind was nobody's. Nobody's. Mr. Gowan made it no concern of his whether it was nobody's or somebody's. He preserved his perfect serenity of manner on all occasions, as if the possibility of Clennam's presuming to have debated the greater question were too distant and ridiculous to be imagined. He had always an affability to bestow on Clennam, and an ease to treat him with, which might of itself, in the supposititious case of his not having taken that sagacious course, have been a very uncomfortable element in his state of mind. "I quite regret you were not with us yesterday," said Mr. Henry Gowan, calling on Clennam the next morning. "We had an agreeable day up the river there." So he had heard, Arthur said. "From your partner?" returned Henry Gowan. "What a dear old fellow he is! I have a great regard for him. By Jove, he is the finest creature," said Gowan. "So fresh, so green, trusts in such wonderful things." Here was one of the many little rough points that had a tendency to grate on Clennam's hearing. He put it aside by merely repeating that he had a high regard for Mr. Doyce. "He is charming. To see him mooning along to that time of life, laying down nothing by the way and picking up nothing by the way, is delightful. It warms a man. So unspoiled, so simple, such a good soul. Upon my life, Mr. Clennam, one feels desperately worldly and wicked in comparison with such an innocent creature. I speak for myself, let me add, without including you. You are genuine also." "Thank you for the compliment," said Clennam, ill at ease. "You are too, I hope?" So, rejoined the other. "To be candid with you, tolerably. I am not a great impostor. Buy one of my pictures, and I assure you in confidence it will not be worth the money. Buy one of another man's, any great professor who beats me hollow, and the chances are that the more you give him, the more he'll impose upon you. They all do it." "All painters?" "Painters, writers, patriots, all the rest who have stands in the market. Give almost any man I know £10, and he will impose upon you to a corresponding extent. £1,000 to a corresponding extent. £10,000 to a corresponding extent. So great the success, so great the imposition. But what a capital world it is!" cried Gowan with warm enthusiasm. "What a jolly, excellent, lovable world it is!" "I had rather thought," said Clennam, "that the principle you mention was chiefly acted on by—" "By the barnacles," interrupted Gowan, laughing. "By the political gentlemen who condescend to keep the circumlocution office." "Ah, don't be hard upon the barnacles," said Gowan, laughing afresh. "They're darling fellows. Even poor little Clarence, the born idiot of the family, is the most agreeable and most endearing blockhead, and by Jupiter, what a kind of cleverness in him too that would astonish you!" "It would, very much," said Clennam dryly. "And after all," cried Gowan, with that characteristic balancing of his, which reduced everything in the wide world to the same light weight, "though I can't deny that the Circumlocution Office may ultimately shipwreck everybody and everything, still that will probably not be in our time, and it's a school for gentlemen." "It's a very dangerous, unsatisfactory, and expensive school to the people who pay to keep the pupils there, I'm afraid," said Clennam, shaking his head. "Ah, you are a terrible fellow," returned Gowan, airily. "I can understand how you have frightened that little donkey, Clarence, the most estimable of moon calves, I really love him, nearly out of his wits. But enough of him, and of all the rest of them. I want to present you to my mother, Mr. Clennam. Pray do me the favour to give me the opportunity." In nobody's state of mind there was nothing Clennam would have desired less, or would have been more at a loss how to avoid. "My mother lives in a most primitive manner down in that dreary red-brick dungeon at Hampton Court," said Gowan. "If you would make your own appointment, suggest your own day, for permitting me to take you there to dinner, you would be bored and she would be charmed. Really, that's the state of the case." What could Clennam say after this? His retiring character included a great deal that was simple in the best sense, because unpractised and unused, and in his simplicity and modesty he could only say that he was happy to place himself at Mr. Gowan's disposal. Accordingly he said it, and the day was fixed. And a dreaded day it was on his part, and a very unwelcome day when it came, and they went down to Hampton Court together. The venerable inhabitants of that venerable pile seemed in those times to be encamped there like a sort of civilized gipsies. There was a temporary air about their establishments, as if they were going away the moment they could get anything better. There was also a dissatisfied air about themselves, as if they took it very ill that they had not already got something much better. Genteel blinds and makeshifts were more or less observable as soon as their doors were opened. Screens not half high enough, which made dining-rooms out of arched passages, and warded off obscure corners where foot-boys slept at nights with their heads among the knives and forks. Curtains which called upon you to believe that they didn't hide anything. Panes of glass which requested you not to see them. Many objects of various forms, feigning to have no connection with their guilty secret. A bed. Disguised traps in walls, which were clearly coal cellars. Affectations of no thoroughfares, which were evidently doors to little kitchens. Mental reservations and artful mysteries grew out of these things. Callers looking steadily into the eyes of their receivers pretended not to smell cooking 3 feet off. People confronting closets accidentally left open pretended not to see bottles. Visitors with their heads against a partition of thin canvas, and a page and a young female at high words on the other side, made believe to be sitting in a primeval silence. There was no end to the small social accommodation bills of this nature which the gipsies of gentility were constantly drawing upon, and accepting for one another. Some of these bohemians were of an irritable temperament, as constantly soured and vexed by 2 mental trials. The first, the consciousness that they had never got enough out of the public. The second, the consciousness that the public were admitted into the building. Under the latter great wrong, a few suffered dreadfully, particularly on Sundays, when they had for some time expected the earth to open and swallow the public up, but which desirable event had not yet occurred, in consequence of some reprehensible laxity in the arrangements of the universe. Mrs. Gowan's door was attended by a family servant of several years' standing, who had his own crow to pluck with the public concerning a situation in the post-office, which he had been for some time expecting, and to which he was not yet appointed. He perfectly knew that the public could never have got him in, but he grimly gratified himself with the idea that the public kept him out. Under the influence of this injury, and perhaps of some little straitness and irregularity in the matter of wages, he had grown neglectful of his person and morose in mind. And now, beholding in Clennam one of the degraded body of his oppressors, received him with ignominy. Mrs. Gowan, however, received him with condescension. He found her a courtly old lady, formerly a beauty, and still sufficiently well favoured to have dispensed with the powder on her nose, and a certain impossible bloom under each eye. She was a little lofty with him. So was another old lady, dark-browed and high-nosed, and who must have had something real about her, or she could not have existed, but it was certainly not her hair or her teeth, or her figure or her complexion. So was a grey old gentleman of dignified and sullen appearance, both of whom had come to dinner. But as they had all been in the British Embassy way in sundry parts of the earth, and as a British Embassy cannot better establish a character with the Circumlocution Office than by treating its compatriots with illimitable contempt, else it would become like the embassies of other countries, Clennam felt that on the whole they let him off lightly. The dignified old gentleman turned out to be Lord Lancaster Stilstalking, who had been maintained by the Circumlocution Office for many years as a representative of the Britannic Majesty abroad. This noble refrigerator had iced several European courts in his time, and had done it with such complete success that the very name of Englishman yet struck cold to the stomachs of foreigners, who had the distinguished honour of remembering him at a distance of a quarter of a century. He was now in retirement, and hence, in a ponderous white cravat, like a stiff snowdrift, was so obliging as to shade the dinner. There was a whisper of the pervading Bohemian character in the nomadic nature of the service, and its curious races of plates and dishes, but the noble refrigerator, infinitely better than plate or porcelain, made it superb. He shaded the dinner, cooled the wines, chilled the gravy, and blighted the vegetables. There was only one other person in the room, a microscopically small footboy, who waited on the malevolent man who hadn't got into the post-office. Even this youth, if his jacket could have been unbuttoned and his card laid bare, would have been seen as a distant adherent of the Barnacle family, all ready to aspire to a situation under government. Mrs. Gowan, with the gentle melancholy upon her, occasioned by her son's being reduced to court the swinish public as a follower of the low arts, instead of asserting his birthright and putting a ring through its nose as an acknowledged barnacle, headed the conversation at dinner on the evil days. It was then that Clennam learned for the first time what little pivots this great world goes round upon. "If John Barnacle," said Mrs. Gowan, after the degeneracy of the times had been fully ascertained, "if John Barnacle had but abandoned his most unfortunate idea of conciliating the mob, all would have been well, and I think the country would have been preserved." The old lady with the high nose assented, but added that if Augustus Stilstalking had in a general way ordered the cavalry out with instructions to charge, she thought the country would have been preserved. The noble refrigerator assented, but added that if William Barnacle and Tudor Stilstalking, when they came over to one another and formed their ever-memorable coalition, had boldly muzzled the newspapers, and rendered it penal for any editor person to presume to discuss the conduct of any appointed authority abroad or at home, he thought the country would have been preserved. It was agreed that the country, another word for the Barnacles and Stilstalkings, wanted preserving, but how it came to want preserving was not so clear. It was only clear that the question was all about John Barnacle, Augustus Stilstalking, William Barnacle and Tudor Stilstalking, Tom, Dick or Harry Barnacle or Stilstalking, because there was nobody else but mob. And this was the feature of the conversation which impressed Clennam, as a man not used to it, very disagreeably, making him doubt if it were quite right to sit there, silently hearing a great nation narrowed to such little bounds, remembering, however, that in the parliamentary debates, whether on the life of that nation's body or the life of its soul, the question was usually all about and between John Barnacle, Augustus Stilstalking, William Barnacle and Tudor Stilstalking, Tom, Dick or Harry Barnacle or Stilstalking, and nobody else. He said nothing on the part of mob, bethinking himself that mob was used to it. Mr. Henry Gowan seemed to have a malicious pleasure in playing off the three talkers against each other, and in seeing Clennam startled by what they said, having as supreme a contempt for the class that had thrown him off as for the class that had not taken him on, he had no personal disquiet in anything that passed. His healthy state of mind appeared even to derive a gratification from Clennam's position of embarrassment and isolation among the good company. And if Clennam had been in that condition with which nobody was incessantly contending, he would have suspected it, and would have struggled with the suspicion as a meanness, even while he sat at the table. In the course of a couple of hours, the noble refrigerator, at no time less than 100 years behind the period, got about 5 centuries in arrears, and delivered solemn political oracles appropriate to that epoch. He finished by freezing a cup of tea for his own drinking, and retiring at his lowest temperature. Then Mrs. Gowan, who had been accustomed in her days of a vacant arm-chair beside her, to which to summon state to retain her devoted slaves, one by one, for short audiences as marks of her especial favour, invited Clennam with a turn of her fan to approach the presence. He obeyed, and took the tripod recently vacated by Lord Lancaster, still stalking. "Mr. Clennam," said Mrs. Gowan, "apart from the happiness I have in becoming known to you, though in this odiously inconvenient place, a mere barrack, there is a subject on which I am dying to speak to you. It is the subject in connection with which my son first had, I believe, the pleasure of cultivating your acquaintance." Clennam inclined his head, as a generally suitable reply to what he did not yet quite understand. "First," said Mrs. Gowan, "now, is she really pretty?" In nobody's difficulties, he would have found it very difficult to answer, very difficult indeed to smile and say, "Who?" "Oh, you know," she returned, "this flame of Henry's, this unfortunate fancy, there, if it is a point of honour that I should originate the name, Miss Miggles. "Miss Meagles," said Clennam, "is very beautiful." "Men are so often mistaken on these points," returned Mrs. Gowan, shaking her head, "that I candidly confess to you I feel anything but sure of it, even now. Though it is something to have Henry corroborated with so much gravity and emphasis. He picked the people up at Rome, I think." The phrase would have given nobody mortal offence. Clennam replied, "Excuse me, I doubt if I understand your expression." "Pick the people up," said Mrs. Gowan, tapping the sticks of her closed fan, a large green one, which she used as a hand-screen on her little table. "Came upon them, found them out, stumbled up against them." "The people?" "Yes, the Miggles people." "I really cannot say," said Clennam, "where my friend Mr. Meagles first presented Mr. Henry Gowan to his daughter." "I am pretty sure he picked her up at Rome, but never mind where, somewhere. Now, this is entirely between ourselves. Is she very plebeian?" "Really, ma'am," returned Clennam, "I am so undoubtedly plebeian myself that I do not feel qualified to judge." "Very neat," said Mrs. Gowan, coolly unfurling her screen. "Very happy, from which I infer that you secretly think her manner equal to her looks." Clennam, after a moment's stiffness, bowed. "That's comforting, and I hope you may be right. Did Henry tell me you had travelled with them?" "I travelled with my friend Mr. Meagles and his wife and daughter during some months." Nobody's heart might have been wrung by the remembrance. "Really comforting, because you must have had a large experience of them. You see, Mr. Clennam, this thing has been going on for a long time, and I find no improvement in it. Therefore, to have the opportunity of speaking to one so well informed about it as yourself is an immense relief to me. Quite a boon, quite a blessing, I am sure." "Pardon me," returned Clennam, "but I am not in Mr. Henry Gowan's confidence. I am far from being so well informed as you suppose me to be. Your mistake makes my position a very delicate one. No word on this topic has ever passed between Mr. Henry Gowan and myself." Mrs. Gowan glanced at the other end of the room, where her son was playing écarté on a sofa, with the old lady who was for a charge of cavalry. "Not in his confidence? No?" said Mrs. Gowan. "No word has passed between you?" "No, that I can imagine. But there are unexpressed confidences, Mr. Clennam, and as you have been together intimately among these people, I cannot doubt that a confidence of that sort exists in the present case. Perhaps you have heard that I have suffered the keenest distress of mind from Henry's having taken to a pursuit which, well," shrugging her shoulders, "a very respectable pursuit, I dare say, and some artists are, as artists, quite superior persons. Still, we never yet in our family have gone beyond an amateur, and it is a pardonable weakness to feel a little—" As Mrs. Gowan broke off to heave a sigh, Clennam, however resolute to be magnanimous, could not keep down the thought that there was mighty little danger of the family's ever going beyond an amateur, even as it was. "Henry," the mother resumed, "is self-willed and resolute, and as these people naturally strain every nerve to catch him, I can entertain very little hope, Mr. Clennam, that the thing will be broken off. I apprehend the girl's fortune will be very small. Henry might have done much better. There is scarcely anything to compensate for the connection. Still, he acts for himself, and if I find no improvement within a short time, I see no other course than to resign myself and make the best of these people. I am infinitely obliged to you for what you have told me." As she shrugged her shoulders, Clennam stiffly bowed again. With an uneasy flush upon his face, and hesitation in his manner, he then said in a still lower tone than he had adopted yet, "Mrs. Gowan, I scarcely know how to acquit myself of what I feel to be a duty, and yet I must ask you for your kind consideration in attempting to discharge it. A misconception on your part, a very great misconception if I may venture to call it so, seems to require setting right. You have supposed Mr. Meagles and his family to strain every nerve. I think you said—" "Every nerve," repeated Mrs. Gowan, looking at him in calm obstinacy, with her green fan between her face and the fire, "to secure Mr. Henry Gowan." The lady placidly assented. "Now, that is so far," said Arthur, "from being the case, that I know Mr. Meagles to be unhappy in this matter, and to have interposed all reasonable obstacles with the hope of putting an end to it." Mrs. Gowan shut up her great green fan, tapped him on the arm with it, and tapped her smiling lips. "Why, of course," said she, "just what I mean." Arthur watched her face for some explanation of what she did mean. "Are you really serious, Mr. Clennam? Don't you see?" Arthur did not see, and said so. "Why, don't I know my son, and don't I know that this is exactly the way to hold him?" said Mrs. Gowan contemptuously. "And do not these Miggles people know it, at least as well as I? Oh, shrewd people, Mr. Clennam, evidently people of business. I believe Miggles belonged to a bank. It ought to have been a very profitable bank, if he had much to do with its management. This is very well done indeed." "I beg and entreat you, ma'am," Arthur interposed. "Oh, Mr. Clennam, can you really be so credulous?" It made such a painful impression upon him to hear her talking in this haughty tone, and to see her patting her contemptuous lips with her fan, that he said very earnestly, "Believe me, ma'am, this is unjust, a perfectly groundless suspicion." "Suspicion?" repeated Mrs. Gowan. "Not suspicion, Mr. Clennam. Certainty. It is very knowingly done indeed, and seems to have taken you in completely." She laughed, and again sat tapping her lips with her fan, and tossing her head, as if she added, "Don't tell me. I know such people will do anything for the honour of such an alliance." At this opportune moment the cards were thrown up, and Mr. Henry Gowan came across the room, saying, "Mother, if you can spare Mr. Clennam for this time, we have a long way to go, and it's getting late." Mr. Clennam thereupon rose, as he had no choice but to do, and Mrs. Gowan showed him, to the last, the same look and the same tapped contemptuous lips. "You have had a portentously long audience of my mother," said Gowan, as the door closed upon them. "I fervently hope she has not bored you." "Not at all," said Clennam. They had a little open phaeton for the journey, and were soon in it on the road home. Gowan, driving, lighted a cigar. Clennam declined one. Do what he would, he fell into such a mood of abstraction that Gowan said again, "I am very much afraid my mother has bored you," to which he roused himself to answer, "Not at all," and soon relapsed again. In that state of mind, which rendered nobody uneasy, his thoughtfulness would have turned principally on the man at his side. He would have thought of the morning when he first saw him rooting out the stones with his heel, and would have asked himself, "Does he jerk me out of the path in the same careless, cruel way?" He would have thought, had this introduction to his mother been brought about by him because he knew what she would say, and that he could thus place his position before a rival and loftily warn him off, without himself reposing a word of confidence in him? He would have thought, even if there were no such design as that, had he brought him there to play with his repressed emotions and torment him, the current of these meditations would have been stayed sometimes by a rush of shame, bearing a remonstrance to himself from his own open nature, representing that to shelter such suspicions, even for the passing moment, was not to hold the high, unenvious course he had resolved to keep. At those times, the striving within him would have been hardest, and looking up and catching Gowan's eyes, he would have started as if he had done him an injury. Then, looking at the dark road and its uncertain objects, he would have gradually trailed off again into thinking, "Where are we driving, he and I wonder, on the darker road of life? How will it be with us and with her in the obscure distance?" Thinking of her, he would have been troubled anew with a reproachful misgiving that it was not even loyal to her to dislike him, and that in being so easily prejudiced against him, he was less deserving of her than at first. "You are evidently out of spirits," said Gowan. "I am very much afraid my mother must have bored you dreadfully." "Believe me, not at all," said Clennam. "It's nothing, nothing." End of chapter the 26th, book the 1st. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter the 27th, book the 1st of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Ellis Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Book the 1st. Chapter the 27th. 5–20. A frequently recurring doubt whether Mr. Panks's desire to collect information relative to the Dorrit family could have any possible bearing on the misgivings he had imparted to his mother on his return from his long exile, caused Arthur Clennam much uneasiness at this period. What Mr. Panks already knew about the Dorrit family, what more he really wanted to find out, and why he should trouble his busy head about them at all, were questions that often perplexed him. Mr. Panks was not a man to waste his time and trouble in researches prompted by idle curiosity. That he had a specific object Clennam could not doubt, and whether the attainment of that object by Mr. Panks's industry might bring to light, in some untimely way, secret reasons which had induced his mother to take Little Dorrit by the hand, was a serious speculation. Not that he ever wavered either in his desire or his determination to repair a wrong that had been done in his father's time, should a wrong come to light, and be repairable. The shadow of a supposed act of injustice, which had hung over him since his father's death, was so vague and formless, that it might be the result of a reality widely remote from his idea of it. But if his apprehensions should prove to be well founded, he was ready at any moment to lay down all he had, and begin the world anew. As the fierce dark teaching of his childhood had never sunk into his heart, so that first article in his code of moral was, that he must begin, in practical humility, with looking well to his feet on earth, and that he could never mount on wings of words to heaven. Duty on earth, restitution on earth, action on earth, these first, as the first steep steps upward. Strait was the gate, and narrow was the way, far straighter and narrower than the broad high road paved with vain professions and vain repetitions, motes from other men's eyes, and liberal delivery of others to the judgment, all cheap materials costing absolutely nothing. No, it was not a selfish fear or hesitation that rendered him uneasy, but a mistrust lest Banks might not observe his part of the understanding between them, and, making any discovery, might take some course upon it without imparting it to him. On the other hand, when he recalled his conversation with Banks, and the little reason he had to suppose that there was any likelihood of that strange personage being on that track at all, there were times when he wondered that he made so much of it. Labouring in this sea, as all barks labour in cross seas, he tossed about and came to no haven. The removal of little Dorrit herself from their customary association did not mend the matter. She was so much out and so much in her own room, that he began to miss her and to find a blank in her place. He had written to her to inquire if she were better, and she had written back very gratefully and earnestly telling him not to be uneasy on her behalf, for she was quite well. But he had not seen her, for what, in their intercourse, was a long time. He returned home one evening from an interview with her father, who had mentioned that she was out visiting, which was what he always said when she was hard at work to buy his supper, and found Mr. Meagles in an excited state walking up and down his room. On his opening the door, Mr. Meagles stopped, faced round, and said, "Clennam, Tattycoram." "What's the matter?" "Lost." "Why, bless my heart alive!" cried Clennam in amazement. "What do you mean?" "Wouldn't count 25, sir. Couldn't be got to do it. Stopped at 8, and took herself off." "Left your house?" "Never to come back," said Mr. Meagles, shaking his head. "You don't know that girl's passionate and proud character. A team of horses couldn't draw her back now. The bolts and bars of the old Bastille couldn't keep her." "How did it happen? Pray sit down and tell me." "As to how it happened, it's not so easy to relate, because you must have the unfortunate temperament of the poor impetuous girl herself before you can fully understand it. But it came about in this way. Pet and mother and I have been having a good deal of talk together of late. I'll not disguise from you, Clennam, that those conversations have not been of as bright a kind as I could wish. They have referred to our going away again, in proposing to do which, I have had, in fact, an object." Nobody's heart beat quickly. "An object," said Mr. Meagles, after a moment's pause, "that I will not disguise from you either, Clennam. There is an inclination on the part of my dear child which I am sorry for. Perhaps you guess the person. Henry Gowan." I was not unprepared to hear it. "Well," said Mr. Meagles, with a heavy sigh, "I wish to God you had never had to hear it. However, so it is. Mother and I have done all we could to get the better of it, Clennam. We have tried tender advice, we have tried time, we have tried absence, as yet of no use. Our late conversations have been upon the subject of going away for another year at least, in order that there might be an entire separation and breaking off for that term. Upon that question, Pet has been unhappy, and therefore mother and I have been unhappy." Clennam said that he could easily believe it. "Well," continued Mr. Meagles in an apologetic way, "I admit as a practical man, and I am sure mother would admit as a practical woman, that we do, in families, magnify our troubles and make mountains of our molehills in a way that is calculated to be rather trying to people who look on, to mere outsiders, you know, Clennam. Still, Pet's happiness or unhappiness is quite a life or death question with us, and we may be excused, I hope, for making much of it. At all events, it might have been borne by Tattycoram. Now, don't you think so?" "I do indeed think so," returned Clennam, in most emphatic recognition of this very moderate expectation. "No, sir," said Mr. Meagles, shaking his head ruefully, "she couldn't stand it. The chafing and firing of that girl, the wearing and tearing of that girl within her own breast, has been such that I have softly said to her again and again in passing her, 25, Tattycoram, 25. I heartily wish she could have gone on counting 25 day and night, and then it wouldn't have happened." Mr. Meagles, with a despondent countenance in which the goodness of his heart was even more expressed than in his times of cheerfulness and gaiety, stroked his face down from his forehead to his chin, and shook his head again. I said to mother, not that it was necessary, for she would have thought it all for herself. We are practical people, my dear, and we know her story. We see in this unhappy girl some reflection of what was raging in her mother's heart before ever such a creature as this poor thing was in the world. We'll gloss her temper over, mother. We won't notice it at present, my dear. We'll take advantage of some better disposition in her another time. So we said nothing. But, do what we would, it seems as if it was to be. She broke out violently one night. How and why? If you ask me why, said Mr. Meagles, a little disturbed by the question, for he was far more intent on softening her case than the family's, I can only refer you to what I have just repeated as having been pretty near my words to mother. As to how, we had said good night to Pet in her presence, very affectionately, I must allow, and she had attended Pep upstairs. You remember she was her maid. Perhaps Pet, having been out of sorts, may have been a little more inconsiderate than usual in requiring services of her, but I don't know that I have any right to say so. She was always thoughtful and gentle, the gentlest mistress in the world. Thank you, Clennam, said Mr. Meagles, shaking him by the hand. You have often seen them together. Well, we presently heard this unfortunate Tattycoram loud and angry, and before we could ask what was the matter, Pet came back in a tremble, saying she was frightened of her. Close after her came Tattycoram in a flaming rage. I hate you all three, says she, stamping her foot at us. I am bursting with hate of the whole house. Upon which you? I? Said Mr. Meagles, with a plain good faith that might have commanded the belief of Mrs. Gowan herself. I said, Count 25, Tattycoram. Mr. Meagles again stroked his face and shook his head, with an air of profound regret. She was so used to do it, Clennam, that even then, such a picture of passion as you never saw, she stopped short, looked me full in the face, and counted, as I made out, to 8. But she couldn't control herself to go any further. There she broke down, poor thing, and gave the other 17 to the 4 winds. Then it all burst out. She detested us. She was miserable with us. She couldn't bear it. She wouldn't bear it. She was determined to go away. She was younger than her young mistress, and would she remain to see her always held up as the only creature who was young and interesting, and to be cherished and loved? No, she wouldn't, she wouldn't, she wouldn't. What did we think she, Tattycoram, might have been if she had been caressed and cared for in her childhood, like her young mistress? As good as her? Ah, perhaps 50 times as good. When we pretended to be so fond of one another, we exulted over her. That was what we did. We exulted over her and shamed her, and all in the house did the same. They talked about her fathers and mothers, and brothers and sisters. They liked to drag them up before her face. There was Mrs. Tickit, only yesterday, when her little grandchild was with her, had been amused by the child's trying to call her Tattycoram by the wretched name we gave her, and had laughed at the name. Why, who didn't? And who were we that we should have a right to name her like a dog or a cat? But she didn't care. She would take no more benefits from us. She would fling us her name back again, and she would go. She would leave us that minute. Nobody should stop her, and we should never hear of her again. Mr. Meagles had recited all this with such a vivid remembrance of his original, that he was almost as flushed and hot by this time as he described her to have been. Ah, well, he said, wiping his face, it was of no use trying to reason then with that vehement, panting creature. Heaven knows what her mother's story must have been, so I quietly told her that she should not go at that late hour of night, and I gave her my hand and took her to her room, and locked the house doors. But she was gone this morning. And you know no more of her? No more, returned Mr. Meagles. I have been hunting about all day. She must have gone very early and very silently. I have found no trace of her down about us. Stay, "You want," said Clennam after a moment's reflection, "to see her? I assume that?" "Yes, assuredly. I want to give her another chance. Mother and Pet want to give her another chance. Come, you yourself," said Mr. Meagles persuasively, as if the provocation to be angry were not his own at all, "want to give the poor passionate girl another chance, I know, Clennam." "It would be strange and hard indeed if I did not," said Clennam, "when you are all so forgiving. What I was going to ask you was, have you thought of that Miss Wade?" "I have. I did not think of her until I had pervaded the whole of our neighbourhood, and I don't know that I should have done so then but for finding Mother and Pet, when I went home, full of the idea that Tattycoram must have gone to her. Then, of course, I recalled what she said that day at dinner when you were first with us." "Have you any idea where Miss Wade is to be found?" "To tell you the truth," returned Mr. Meagles, "it's because I have an adult jumble of a notion on that subject that you found me waiting here. There is one of those odd impressions in my house, which do mysteriously get into houses sometimes, which nobody seems to have picked up in a distinct form from anybody, and yet which everybody seems to have got hold of loosely from somebody and let go again, that she lives, or was living, thereabouts." Mr. Meagles handed him a slip of paper, on which was written the name of one of the dull by-streets in the Grosvenor region, near Park Lane. "Here is no number," said Arthur, looking over it. "No number, my dear Clennam," returned his friend. "No anything. The very name of the street may have been floating in the air, for, as I tell you, none of my people can say where they got it from. However, it's worth an inquiry, and as I would rather make it in company than alone, and as you too were a fellow-traveller of that immovable woman's, I thought perhaps—" Clennam finished the sentence for him by taking up his cat again and saying he was ready. It was now summer-time, a grey, hot, dusty evening. They rode to the top of Oxford Street, and there alighting, dived in among the great streets of melancholy stateliness, and the little streets that try to be as stately and succeed in being more melancholy, of which there is a labyrinth near Park Lane. Wilderness of corner houses, with barbarous old porticos and appurtenances, horrors that came into existence under some wrong-headed person in some wrong-headed time, still demanding the blind admiration of all ensuing generations, and determined to do so until they tumbled down. Round upon the twilight, parasite little tenements, with the cramp in their whole frame, from the dwarf hall door on the giant model of his Grace's in the square to the squeezed window of the boudoir commanding the dunghills in the mews, made the evening doleful. Rickety dwellings of undoubted fashion, but of a capacity to hold nothing comfortably except a dismal smell, looked like the last result of the great mansions breeding in and in, and where their little supplementary bows and balconies were supported on thin iron columns, seemed to be scrofulously resting upon crutches. Here and there a hatchment, with the whole science of heraldry in it, loomed down upon the street, like an archbishop discoursing on vanity. The shops, few in number, made no show, for popular opinion was as nothing to them. The pastry cook knew who was on his books, and in that knowledge could be calm, with a few glass cylinders of dowager peppermint drops in his window, and half a dozen ancient specimens of currant jelly. A few oranges formed the greengrocer's whole concession to the vulgar mind. A single basket made of moss, once containing plovers' eggs, held all that the poulterer had to say to the rabble. Everybody in those streets seemed, which is always the case at that hour and season, to be gone out to dinner, and nobody seemed to be giving the dinners they had gone to. On the doorsteps there were lounging footmen with bright parti-coloured plumage, and white polls, like an extinct race of monstrous birds, and butlers, solitary men of recluse demeanour, each of whom appeared distrustful of all other butlers. The roll of carriages in the park was done for the day. The street lamps were lighting, and wicked little grooms in the tightest fitting garments, with twists in their legs answering to the twists in their minds, hung about in pairs, chewing straws and exchanging fraudulent secrets. The spotted dogs who went out with the carriages, and who were so associated with splendid equipages that it looked like a condescension in those animals to come out without them, accompanied helpers to and fro on messages. Here and there was a retiring public house which did not require to be supported on the shoulders of the people, and where gentlemen out of livery were not much wanted. This last discovery was made by the two friends in pursuing their inquiries. Nothing was there or anywhere known of such a person as Miss Wade, in connection with the street they sought. It was one of the parasite streets, long, regular, narrow, dull, and gloomy, like a brick-and-mortar funeral. They inquired at several little area gates, where a dejected youth stood spiking his chin on the summit of a precipitous little chute of wooden steps, but could gain no information. They walked up the street on one side of the way, and down it on the other, what time two vociferous news-sellers announcing an extraordinary event that had never happened and never would happen, pitched their hoarse voices into the secret chambers. But nothing came of it. At length they stood at the corner from which they had begun, and it had fallen quite dark, and they were no wiser. It happened that in the street they had several times passed a dingy house, apparently empty, with bills in the windows, announcing that it was to let. The bills, as a variety in the funeral procession, almost amounted to a decoration. Perhaps because they kept the house separated in his mind, or perhaps because Mr. Meagles and himself had twice agreed, in passing, "It is clear she don't live there." Clennam now proposed that they should go back and try that house before finally going away. Mr. Meagles agreed, and back they went. They knocked once, and they rang once, without any response. "Empty," said Mr. Meagles, listening. "Once more," said Clennam, and knocked again. After that knock they heard a movement below, and somebody shuffling up towards the door. The confined entrance was so dark that it was impossible to make out distinctly what kind of person opened the door, but it appeared to be an old woman. "Excuse our troubling you," said Clennam. "Pray, can you tell us where Miss Wade lives?" The voice in the darkness unexpectedly replied, "Lives here." "Is she at home?" No answer coming, Mr. Meagles asked again, "Pray, is she at home?" After another delay, "I suppose she is," said the voice abruptly. "You had better come in, and I'll ask." They were summarily shut into the close black house, and the figure rustling away, and speaking from a higher level, said, "Come up, if you please. You can't tumble over anything." They groped their way upstairs towards a faint light, which proved to be the light of the street shining through a window, and the figure left them shut in an airless room. "This is odd, Clennam," said Mr. Meagles softly. "Odd enough," assented Clennam in the same tone. "But we have succeeded. That's the main point. Here's a light coming." The light was a lamp, and the bearer was an old woman, very dirty, very wrinkled and dry. "She's at home," she said, and the voice was the same that had spoken before. "She'll come directly." Having set the lamp down on the table, the old woman dusted her hands on her apron, which she might have done for ever without cleaning them, looked at the visitors with a dim pair of eyes, and backed out. The lady whom they had come to see, if she were the present occupant of the house, appeared to have taken up her quarters there as she might have established herself in an eastern caravanserai. A small square of carpet in the middle of the room, a few articles of furniture that evidently did not belong to the room, and a disorder of trunks and travelling articles formed the whole of her surroundings. Under some former regular inhabitant, the stifling little apartment had broken out into a pier glass and a gilt table. But the gilding was as faded as last year's flowers, and the glass was so clouded that it seemed to hold in magic preservation all the fogs and bad weather it had ever reflected. The visitors had had a minute or two to look about them, when the door opened and Miss Wade came in. She was exactly the same as when they had parted, just as handsome, just as scornful, just as repressed. She manifested no surprise in seeing them, nor any other emotion. She requested them to be seated, and declining to take a seat herself, at once anticipated any introduction of their business. "I apprehend," she said, that I know the cause of your favouring me with this visit. We may come to it at once." "The cause, then, ma'am," said Mr. Meagles, "is Tattycoram." "So I supposed." "Miss Wade," said Mr. Meagles, "will you be so kind as to say whether you know anything of her?" "Surely. I know she is here with me." "Then, ma'am," said Mr. Meagles, "allow me to make known to you that I shall be happy to have her back, and that my wife and daughter will be happy to have her back. She has been with us a long time. We don't forget her claims upon us, and I hope we know how to make allowances." "You hope to know how to make allowances," she returned in a level, measured voice. "For what?" "I think my friend would say, Miss Wade," Arthur Clennam interposed, seeing Mr. Meagles rather at a loss, for the passionate sense that sometimes comes upon the poor girl of being at a disadvantage, which occasionally gets the better of better remembrances. The lady broke into a smile as she turned her eyes upon him. "Indeed?" was all she answered. She stood by the table so perfectly composed and still after this acknowledgment of his remark, that Mr. Meagles stared at her under a sort of fascination, and could not even look to Clennam to make another move. After waiting, awkwardly enough, for some moments, Arthur said, "Perhaps it would be well if Mr. Meagles could see her, Miss Wade." "That is easily done," said she. "Come here, child." She had opened a door while saying this, and now led the girl in by the hand. It was very curious to see them standing together, the girl with her disengaged fingers plaiting the bosom of her dress, half irresolutely, half passionately, Miss Wade with her composed face attentively regarding her, and suggesting to an observer with extraordinary force, in her composure itself, as a veil will suggest the form it covers, the unquenchable passion of her own nature. "See here," she said, in the same level way as before. "Here is your patron, your master. He is willing to take you back, my dear, if you are sensible of the favour and choose to go. You can be again a foil to his pretty daughter, a slave to her pleasant wilfulness, and a toy in the house showing the goodness of the family. You can have your droll name again, playfully pointing you out and setting you apart, as it is right that you should be pointed out and set apart. Your birth, you know, you must not forget your birth. You can again be shown to this gentleman's daughter, Harriet, and kept before her, as a living reminder of her own superiority and her gracious condescension. You can recover all these advantages and many more of the same kind which I dare say start up in your memory while I speak, and which you lose in taking refuge with me. You can recover them all by telling these gentlemen how humbled and penitent you are, and by going back to them to be forgiven. What do you say, Harriet? Will you go?" The girl, who under the influence of these words had gradually risen in anger and heightened in colour, answered, raising her lustrous black eyes for the moment, and clenching her hand upon the folds it had been puckering up, "I'd die sooner." Miss Wade, still standing at her side holding her hand, looked quietly round and said with a smile, "Gentlemen, what do you do upon that?" Poor Mr. Meagles's inexpressible consternation in hearing his motives and actions so perverted had prevented him from interposing any word until now. But now he regained the power of speech. "Tattycoram," said he, "for I'll call you by that name still, my good girl, conscious that I meant nothing but kindness when I gave it to you, and conscious that you know it." "I don't," said she, looking up again, and almost rending herself with the same busy hand. "No, not now, perhaps," said Mr. Meagles, "not with that lady's eye so intent upon you, Tattycoram." She glanced at them for a moment. "And that power over you, which we see she exercises. Not now, perhaps, but at another time. Tattycoram, I'll not ask that lady whether she believes what she has said, even in the anger and ill blood in which I and my friend here equally know she has spoken, though she subdues herself, with a determination that any one who has once seen her is not likely to forget. I'll not ask you, with your remembrance of my house and all belonging to it, whether you believe it. I'll only say that you have no profession to make to me or mine, and no forgiveness to entreat, and that all in the world that I ask you to do is to count 25, Tattycoram." She looked at him for an instant, and then said frowningly, "I won't. Miss Wade, take me away, please." The contention that raged within her had no softening in it now. It was wholly between passionate defiance and stubborn defiance. Her rich colour, her quick blood, her rapid breath, were all setting themselves against the opportunity of retracing their steps. "I won't, I won't, I won't," she repeated in a low, thick voice. "I'd be torn to pieces first. I'd tear myself to pieces first." Miss Wade, who had released her hold, laid her hand protectingly on the girl's neck for a moment, and then said, looking round with her former smile, and speaking exactly in her former tone, "Gentlemen, what do you do upon that?" "Oh, Tattycoram, Tattycoram!" cried Mr. Meagles, adjuring her besides with an earnest hand. "Hear that lady's voice, look at that lady's face, consider what is in that lady's heart, and think what a future lies before you. My child, whatever you may think, that lady's influence over you, astonishing to us, and I should hardly go too far in saying terrible to us to see, is founded in passion fiercer than yours, and temper more violent than yours. What can you two be together? What can come of it?" "I am alone here, gentlemen," observed Miss Wade, with no change of voice or manner. "Say anything you will." "Politeness must yield to this misguided girl, ma'am," said Mr. Meagles, "at her present pass, though I hope not altogether to dismiss it, even with the injury you do her so strongly before me. Excuse me for reminding you in her hearing, I must say it, that you were a mystery to all of us, and had nothing in common with any of us when she unfortunately fell in your way. I don't know what you are, but you don't hide, can't hide, what a dark spirit you have within you. If it should happen that you are a woman who, from whatever cause, has a perverted delight in making a sister woman as wretched as she is, I am old enough to have heard of such, I warn her against you, and I warn you against yourself." "Gentlemen," said Miss Wade calmly, "when you have concluded, Mr. Clennam, perhaps you will induce your friend—" "Not without another effort," said Mr. Meagles stoutly. "Tattycoram, my poor dear girl, count 25. "Do not reject the hope, the certainty, this kind man offers you," said Clennam in a low, emphatic voice. "Turn to the friends you have not forgotten. Think once more." "I won't. Miss Wade," said the girl, with her bosom swelling high, and speaking with her hand held to her throat, "take me away." "Tattycoram," said Mr. Meagles, "once more yet. The only thing I ask of you in the world, my child, count 25. She put her hands tightly over her ears, confusedly tumbling down her bright black hair in the vehemence of the action, and turned her face resolutely to the wall. Miss Wade, who had watched her under this final appeal with that strange attentive smile, and that repressing hand upon her own bosom with which she had watched her in her struggle at Marseilles, then put her arm about her waist, as if she took possession of her for evermore. And there was a visible triumph in her face when she turned it to dismiss the visitors. "As it is the last time I shall have the honour," she said, "and as you have spoken of not knowing what I am, and also of the foundation of my influence here, you may now know that it is founded in a common cause. What your broken plaything is as to birth, I am. She has no name. I have no name. Her wrong is my wrong. I have nothing more to say to you." This was addressed to Mr. Meagles, who sorrowfully went out. As Clennam followed, she said to him with the same external composure, and in the same level voice, but with a smile that is only seen on cruel faces, a very faint smile, lifting the nostril, scarcely touching the lips, and not breaking away gradually, but instantly dismissed when done with. "I hope the wife of your dear friend Mr. Gowan may be happy in the contrast of her extraction to this girl's and mine, and in the high good fortune that awaits her." End of chapter the 27th, Book the 1st. This recording is in the public domain.